waiting on Tara's tox results. Will be a while yet. That, or the killer is using a rural property to do the killing, which Proctor doesn't have. And Jackson was found in the countryside, as he pretty much said a minute ago. Proctor could have access to a place we don't yet know about. Her phone notified her of a new message. She expected it to be Troy, but it was Richards. Full report to follow tomorrow in email. TOD yesterday between 11 a.m. and 6 p.m. That's quite the time of death window, Terry said. I'd say we could possibly shorten it some. Her phone last pinged at 12:30. So we can likely shave a whole 1.5 hours off the window. That still leaves us with a lot of time to uncover her movements. And our prime suspect says he was outside the Sunrise building on Monday around 2. He might not be our guy. Or he's lying. It's not like we have proof of what he told us. He gave us some story about why he figured something happened to Tara, but it could be to cover his butt because he killed her. What she'd give to return to the station, drag Proctor's sorry ass from the cells, and have another go at him. But the words, build a case, ricocheted in her head. She and Terry stayed at Proctor's apartment for 2 hours, going over every inch. During that time, Mark Andrews had turned up and lifted some prints. He was able to confirm on location using a special apparatus that some of these belonged to Tara Jackson. Ones lifted from the nightstand in the bedroom and a cabinet door in the kitchen. Not exactly damning evidence, as Proctor had a relationship with Tara, and it was attested to by Tara's friends, who knew of a man named Gabe she was seeing. Once they had a burner phone in hand they could tie to Tara, they could confirm if she was communicating with him. Madison found Mark in the bedroom closing up his collection kit. Just finished here, he said. But given the way you're looking at me, is there something I can do for you? Terry joined them in the room. Did you guys get to the tote yet? She asked. Mark winced. Not yet. Not with... The second homicide, Terry inserted. Yes, that. There's getting to be a bit of a backlog. Exactly why we need to stop it from building, Madison pushed. 2 young women have already lost their lives. It has to stop there. She was quaking. Frustration and self-judgment were fighting for dominance within her. Thought you had the killer in custody, Mark volleyed back. Madison took a deep breath, wishing that were true. With Proctor behind bars, the killing would stop. That was assuming he hadn't left more surprises before they apprehended him. But Winston would likely be pushing for Proctor's release more adamantly than he had before. We need to gather all we can against Proctor before we're forced to let him walk. He could have left his prints on the tote or the items inside, assuming the evidence is there to find, she added as an afterthought. Could her desperation to make up for past shortcomings be blinding her and pushing her toward an innocent man? Or was her gut instinct on point? I assure you we'll get to it as soon as we can. She kept her gaze on the investigator, but she really wasn't looking at him. Her mind was miles away on what was happening to her city. More importantly, what she could do to prevent more death. The second you know anything, you'll know, Mark smiled. Thank you. She turned to Terry, who shook his head. We've got nothing, Terry said. No knives that could have been used for stabbing or mutilation. With the words came the visuals, and she squeezed out the images quickly. He'd be rather dumb to leave them sitting around, but he has other things against him. What did the building manager say? Any video in the lobby? Terry shook his head. And officers have spoken to Proctor's neighbors. None can confirm he was home Saturday night. That still doesn't really leave us with anything solid enough to justify holding him. But let me run it past Winston. You best buddies now? The question slapped out, but even given the torn look on Terry's face, she didn't regret it. He was hiding something, and she was tired of dancing around it. I'm just doing my job, Madison. I'm a detective. Winston is our sergeant, a man we report to. Right, because you're usually all over that. He flailed an arm over his head as he left the room. Mark walked past her, and she felt a prick of embarrassment, as he'd witnessed her bickering with Terry. But why should she care what the investigator thought? She was hurting. Call it a hunch. But she had the feeling one of the few people she trusted in this world was about to stab her in the back. Terry poked his head into the room a few minutes later. "Are you coming?" "Where are we going?" "Back to talk with Proctor." "You called Winston, didn't you?" "I did, and he's on board with us pulling Proctor back in for questioning. He sees that there are several things starting to stack up against him. Winston even suggests we press harder." So Terry had a chat with Winston, and everything was now rainbows and lollipops. "Huh. Interesting how convinced he is when questioning Proctor is your idea. I'm not sure when you two became so buddy-buddy." A pulse tapped in Terry's cheek, a sure tell he was angry. "We're not buddy-buddy, but we, as in you and me, have more now than we did the last time we questioned Proctor. We've confirmed that he has no alibi for the time of Jackson's murder." "Fine, let's go. We'll get the officers to lock up." "Suits me." She followed him out, but was waging an internal struggle. Did she pressure him to speak now or leave him alone? She decided to let it go again, for now. Surely, she'd find out what was going on with her partner soon enough. Ideally, before she lost her mind. Chapter 28. "Detectives, I sure hope you have a strong reason to drag us in here again." Proctor's defense attorney looked a touch inebriated, and there was a light stain of red in the corners of his mouth. Likely red wine, and hopefully he'd gotten a ride to the station and hadn't driven himself. Madison sat at the table, and this time Terry dropped into the chair next to her. She opened a folder she'd brought in and fished out the photo of Joanna Chase from the licensing office. She calmly set it across the table, facing Proctor. Proctor didn't give the picture more than a second's glance. "I don't know her." "Look hard," she pushed. "Fine." His jaw fell slack and his complexion paled. "Mr. Proctor," Madison prompted. "Want to try again?" Yeah. Proctor looked at his lawyer, who held up a reassuring hand. "Detective, it's late. Tell us what you have. That's if you have anything. Then let us get on with our lives." "Her name is Joanna Chase," Madison said. "Her body was found inside a duffel bag that was in a sand bin behind the backstop of a baseball diamond." Proctor's eyes glazed over, and he swallowed roughly. Madison went on. "She worked at Willow Properties. It's in the same building where your client works in the mailroom." Proctor opened his mouth as if he were about to talk. The lawyer tapped Proctor's forearm. "That's enough, Gabe." The man straightened his tie. "The fact my client works in the same building as this woman means nothing. Unless you can tie my client to this Miss Chase and her murder, I request that you let him go." "Thanks for teeing that up. The thing is, Mr. Proctor has a connection that I'm sure no jury would miss." She put a photo of Tara Jackson next to the one of Joanna Chase. "Mr. Proctor has a type." "Yada yada, detective. I'm hearing a lot of allegations with no facts to back them up." "Gabe, you're nice enough looking, and I can see that if you wanted to, you could pour on the charm. Tara and Joanna likely trusted you, a fact you took advantage of. Where were you yesterday between noon and 1? She asked. "At Tara's condo building." "Then you never saw me or my partner there." They had been there mid-afternoon. "Oh, right. That was closer to 2-something. I'm just so tired that I can't think straight." Proctor rubbed his temple. Madison sat back, silently communicating she had all night. "But at around noon, I was having lunch," Proctor said. "Where was this?" she volleyed back. "Skyline Diner." "Huh." Madison smiled at Terry. "Why the detective?" The lawyer raised his eyebrows. "Joanna Chase's phone last pinged in the vicinity of the diner yesterday at 12:30. "No!" Proctor cried out and slapped his palms on the table. "I had nothing to do with whatever happened to her, I swear." "Where were you yesterday afternoon?" She circled back. Proctor glanced at his lawyer, Then back to her. You just said a second ago that I was outside Tara's building. You said that, actually. How exhausted is this guy? If anyone has anything to prove here, it's you, detective. What factual evidence, besides circumstantial, do you have against my client? She ignored the lawyer, keeping her gaze on Proctor. At this rate, he'd walk for 2 murders and be back on the street to kill again. She grasped onto the one thing that was the most damning. This whole story of yours that... It's not a story, Proctor gasped. You didn't even wait to hear what I was going to say. She paused for a few beats before continuing. You told my partner and I that you put the pieces together and just knew something had happened to Tara. But how? Really? Her murder hadn't even hit the news. Did you know because you killed her? The lawyer sighed and flopped back in his chair, twiddling a pen between his fingers. I told you, Proctor said. I saw you, and Tara wasn't answering her phone. That's what you said. Madison let that sit out there. Surely Proctor had to realize just because he said something, it didn't make it fact, or him innocent. Even seeing those calls in Proctor's phone history did nothing to lessen her suspicion of him. Those calls could have been made to present as a defense. We're going to be taking a very deep dive into you, Mr. Proctor. Didn't you already search his apartment, violate his privacy? The lawyer said. And I'm guessing it turned up nothing to confirm my client killed these women. If it did, you wouldn't be on this fishing expedition, hoping you get my client to slip up. There are many avenues to still pursue. We will be confirming if you and Joanna Chase were ever in contact. His phone didn't give them that, but they could ask people in his building and at his workplace. Proctor ran his hands down his face. Fine, I went out with her once. Gabe, you don't need to say anything, the lawyer cautioned him. Madison smiled. Honesty, finally. So why did you kill her and Tara Jackson? Did they decide they wanted to end things with you? No, I was still with Tara. Joanna came before Tara, a couple of months ago, but just once, he stressed. Describe your relationship with Tara. Were you exclusive? Madison asked. Gabe shook his head. We saw other people. I see, Madison said. But, Mr. Proctor, the fact remains that you have no verifiable alibis for when these 2 women died. You will remain in holding, and we'll be asking for a continuance to hold you longer. She made sure to meet his eyes when she added, We will get you, Mr. Proctor. Make no mistake. But instead of there being defeat on his face, in his body language, he sat straighter. I just thought of something. I can prove I was outside Tara's condo building Monday afternoon. What would that be? She wasn't putting much stock in what he might say. It was likely going to be a desperate move made by an even more desperate person. I bought a couple tacos from the 3 amigos. They're in the ground floor of the building next to the Sunrise. Yes, I know where they are. But would anyone at the Mexican restaurant remember Proctor? They'd have a lot of foot traffic passing through in a day. Might be hard to prove that. And you just told us you had lunch at Skyline Diner. I have a healthy appetite and got munchy. But I can prove what I'm telling you. I got a receipt. Check with the officer who took my personal effects. I jammed it into my pants pocket. The timestamp on it should confirm I was in that area when I said I was. The lawyer sat back, crossed his arms. Go, detectives. Prove my client's innocence. Not so quick, Madison said. Even if we find that receipt, there's still plenty of time in which your client could have killed Joanna Chase. Where were you, Mr. Proctor, from mid-afternoon yesterday until 6 p.m.? Proctor's shoulders relaxed. I met up with my friend John for dinner. That was at 5 o'clock, and then I played a gig at 8. John was one of the friends Madison had already talked to. They likely would have been at the restaurant at least an hour. That would account for the latter portion of Joanna's TOD window. That was, if his friend would testify to this, and they got their hands on the receipt. It still left from the time he hit 3 amigos until 5. But they did need more than a lack of an alibi, means and motive. She and Terry left the room without another word. If what Proctor says holds up, the lawyer's right. We have nothing at this point to justify continuing our hold on Proctor, he said. I know. She hated to accept that Gabe Proctor was telling the truth because of what it would mean. They'd be back at ground zero for suspects. And while they spun their wheels trying to follow scraps for leads, how many other young women might die? She and Terry made their way to the cells and got their hands on Proctor's personal effects. Sure enough, there was a receipt from the three amigos. This shows he bought them at 2:08 p.m. on Monday. Madison called John, and a few seconds later had her answer. Proctor's friend just alibied him for 5 until 6 p.m. But there's still that gap that's unaccounted for between 2 and 5 when he met John. Still, we have zero forensic evidence against Proctor. No means or clue as to any motive. I don't see extending his stay with the Stiles PD flying past Winston. Yep, Proctor's gonna walk. We might do well to consider that Proctor might actually be innocent, Maddie. She sighed. I know. The confession made her feel so powerless. Somehow, we need to get ahead of this killer. Be proactive. Terry didn't respond, but his eyes had darkened. He was probably thinking along the lines that their job typically followed death. But enough was enough. They already had the blood of 2 young women on their hands with this investigation. It had to end there. Chapter 29. He wished he had an ounce of self-control, but he just couldn't stop himself. It seemed the more lives he took, the hungrier he was to kill again. He was that drug addict seeking his next high. Each period between hits was becoming shorter-lived than the time before. And those detectives were a threat to his next experience. What he did for his happiness should be his alone. He could be flattered that the police took notice of his work, but they were locals, not federal. He'd probably need to kill several more people to warrant that attention. As he'd thought before, the prospect wasn't all that unattractive. He'd be famous and go down in history. But his mind balanced the risks. The more law enforcement breathed down his neck, the more his freedom constricted. If he wanted to carry on doing what made him happy, he had to stay one step ahead of them. Though it was too late to turn back from this one. Besides, no one would miss her. He'd already held her for a day without anyone caring. He'd taken her right to his place, and not a single person paid them attention. It was like she made him invisible, and all it took was a drugged coffee to get her cooperation. Not that she had known it was spiked when she drank it, until it was too late. He smiled as he removed the gag from her face. She was fading in and out of consciousness, but her eyes often shot wide open. They were looking at him now. Do you remember me? She barely blinked, and something incoherent bubbled in her throat. You talk too much, or should I say, you did. He stuffed the gag deep into her mouth. Our business transaction was to be between us. I paid you, and you gave me a product. It should have been simple. He paced around the chair he had her in. Her smell was offensive and had him gagging. She really was disgusting. Not his type at all, but he'd make do. She might even mark the first of many vagrants. After all, they wouldn't be missed or draw unnecessary attention. The best part was they bled like everyone else. It remained to be seen if killing her brought the same level of pleasure. But all in good time. Pleasure shouldn't be rushed. He snatched the knife off the nearby shelving unit, holding it across his palm and seeing himself reflected in the blade. I've already kept you alive longer than the others. You should thank me. He thrust the knife into her gut. She opened her mouth to scream, but given the levels of alcohol he'd poured down her throat and the gag, it was barely a mumble. He stabbed her again. Tears streamed down her face as her body convulsed with each strike of the blade. He kept going, repeating the process. Over and over. Each time the knife sank into her flesh, He stood taller, breathed freer. "Huh, you should feel honored. You're the first of your kind." He swept his hand that held the knife over her brow line, watching her eyes grow larger still. But before she could mutter another noise or gurgle, he stabbed a few more times viciously. Blood splattered all over him, hitting his cheeks and neck. Some splashed onto his eyelashes. It was warm. The entire time he was grinning. This was true happiness. But he didn't want to savor all this fun in one session. And he'd be damned if he was going to let the law stop his fun. Chapter 30. Last night had been somewhat disappointing with Proctor's release. It had also been a late one. At least Madison got in some time with Troy before she stumbled into bed, drunk from exhaustion. Sleep had come quickly and was deep, for which she was thankful. That made 2 nights in a row. Her appointment with the therapist this afternoon might be a waste of time. The nightmares from her past, from the present, the paranoia of feeling watched during her waking hours, all gone now. She could hope. Though she had already faced disappointment this morning. Her intention that she'd wake up with some grand epiphany on how to be proactive never manifested. She hoped the theme of the day wasn't going to be dead ends and zero leads. Madison stopped by Bradshaw Park on the way to the station to look for Eunice again. She just needed her confirmation that Gabe Proctor was who had bought the suitcase. But no one had seen Eunice since Monday. So where had she gone? Was she okay? Or had the killer known she'd spoken to them and targeted her? If so, that would mean he had been watching that day, and possibly now. The sun was already up, and while the summer air was warm and humid, chills sliced through her. She rubbed her arms, turning this way, then the other, looking over her shoulders. So much for the prayer her paranoia had vanished along with the insomnia and nightmares. But there were lots of homeless people in the park. Numerous eyeballs could be on her. That's all it is. She wasn't buying it, though. And if this overwhelming sensation was to be trusted, who was watching? The mafia or the killer of at least 2 young women? Neither prospect soothed her. Madison hustled back to her Mazda and floored it to the police station. She made it in record time, and Terry stood and came over to her when she got close to their desks. "There you are. Where have you been?" She looked at the clock on the wall. It was only a few minutes past 8:30. He was acting like she was an hour late. She told him she swung back to Bradshaw Park, but produced nothing for her efforts. "Okay, well, I've been trying to reach you, and so has Cynthia." Her phone hadn't rung all morning. She pulled it out and consulted the screen. Icons confirmed missed calls and voicemails. What the? She unlocked her phone and found it silenced. She had no memory of doing that, or any understanding of why she would have. Maybe she wasn't back to her full self yet. Or losing it? She turned the ringer on and pocketed her phone. "What is it?" "Cynthia won't tell me until you got here, so let's skedaddle." Terry led the way down the hall toward the elevators. They took it up to the 3rd floor and entered the lab. Cynthia was at the large main table, where she often laid out evidence. It was lit from underneath, making it easier to examine items. On top was the light pink tote, a blonde wig, a tablet, 2 phones, a driver's license, a medical insurance card, a credit card, and a key ring. Madison gestured toward the spread of items. "Can you confirm all this was Tara Jackson's?" "That I can," Cynthia said grimly, a hand on her stomach. Her face was flushed, too. "Morning sickness." She must have noticed Madison picking up on how she looked unwell. "Fun and games," Madison volleyed back. "Oh, yes, so much fun." Cynthia smiled at Madison, but turned serious quickly. "The second phone and cards, were they in a pocket?" Madison asked. "They were. Now, we've had a look at both phones. One was a burner. The other one is likely the number you were aware of. The burner isn't telling us much." "Too bad, because it would probably help the case more," Terry said, and shrugged when both women looked at him. "People with burners have something to hide. Secrets and lies equals motives for murder. Unless we're looking at something a little more random, Madison inserted. She had pegged Proctor as their killer, but she and Terry had agreed to keep their minds open. Can you see if the burner phone received calls from a certain number? You know I can. Madison looked up Proctor's digits and gave them to Cynthia. Yep, I see that one here several times on Sunday, Cynthia said. I'm not sure we're looking for a rando. The tethered dating app was on Jackson's primary phone. Thankfully, the app kept her logged in, so I was able to poke around. She met several men for dates. Proctor told us they weren't exclusive. Did one of the Romeos kill her? Terry said. If so, can we tie any to Joanna Chase as well? We'll want their names, Madison said, directed at Cynthia. We'll need to talk to each of them. How many are we talking about? Cynthia rubbed her stomach and stared into space for a few seconds before responding, obviously waiting for nausea to abate. 5 in the last 2 months. Normally, all that's visible within the app are handles, but since Jackson private messaged with the men, I was able to see their profile information. I've got their real names and pictures here. She walked over to her desk and snatched a sheet of paper off the corner. This she handed to Madison. She read the names and studied their faces. Richie Sawyer, Glenn Everett, Lonnie Mercer, Levi Griffin, Vance Newman. Okay, and what about any men she rejected? Madison looked up from the page. Only have their profile handles. Did anyone message her privately in a threatening manner? Terry asked. Cynthia shook her head. I would have told you that. 5 is better than 10. Terry pressed his lips, looked at Madison. What else do you have for us? Anything useful on the tablet? Any prints on the electronics or the tote that could help us? She asked. Just Jackson's and the man who had the tote, James Lewis. We took his prints for the purpose of elimination, but what an incredible man. The stories he could tell. Apparently, it was too much to hope the killer had slipped up and left his prints behind. Have you narrowed down the tire tread to either manufacturer or vehicle type? Do you need to spoil all my fun? I was getting there. But yes, I now know that the tires would belong to a truck. Don't ask make and model. But the tread is consistent with the Bridgestone brand. Far too popular to lead us to a suspect. At best, it might just confirm one, Madison said. It was starting to feel like good leads were never going to come. Any finds worth mentioning from that dumpster or from the chase scene? Unfortunately, whoever our killer is, he is pretty diligent about covering his tracks. Any video in Bradshaw Park? Terry asked. None that would help. Even at the entrances, possibly more CCTV? Madison pushed. No dice. And I know you messaged for me to watch the video from the intersection near Skyline Diner, but I haven't had a spare minute. You know how urgent it is, Cynthia cut in, finishing what Madison was going to say. I do, just like everything else. But there are only so many hours in the day, my friend. You can feel free to watch it for yourself. Being presented with that option, Madison appreciated how overwhelmed Cynthia must feel. While she and Terry didn't have solid leads, they had numerous avenues to explore. The challenge was figuring the best one to pursue first. All right, well, keep us posted. With that, Madison and Terry left the lab. She's right, you know, Terry said. We could watch the video for ourselves. I know, it's just, what if it doesn't give us that huge lead? There are other things we can do. For one, can we connect Jackson and Chase? They came to their killer's attention somehow. Did they travel in the same circles? They moved around the downtown core at least, both near the diner. This reminded her they needed to show some pictures to the owner of Skyline Diner, but something else hit her too. Could it be that both women volunteered at the same places? You want to call Dimes for Dinner and ask if they've heard of Joanna Chase? I'll do the same with Warm Heart Soup Kitchen. Sure. She pulled out her phone, and Manuel Pierce assured her he hadn't heard of her. She ended her call at the same time as Terry. He shook his head. Travers from Dimes for Dinner doesn't know a Joanna Chase. Same on my end. But it was worth a try. Maybe one of these guys can lead us somewhere? She lifted the sheet with the names on it from the dating app. "We'll talk to every one of them, see if they know Joanna Chase." "It's a logical step." She tried to squeeze out the fact that following logic didn't always mean progress. Chapter 31. Madison decided it was past time they requested the financials for Jackson, and she also wanted them for Chase. She figured they'd benefit from a warrant for the video from the lobby in the Sunrise building, too. They might be able to spot Tara Jackson on the video and possibly see her with someone. She had Terry working on the paperwork, while she checked the backgrounds for the 5 Romeos from the dating app. None of them had a criminal record, though she wasn't putting faith in that meaning anything. This killer was good about covering his tracks, and he could have gotten away with crimes in the past. "Everything's been sent over," Terry said. "Now we wait on approval. What's the word on their backgrounds?" "They're all clean." "Then the next step is we visit them, take that long overdue look at Chase's apartment, or talk to those where she worked. Let's start with the last 2, in that order." "All right then. I'll call for verbal authorization to get into Chase's apartment on the way." They got in the department car, and she drove them in the direction of the building where Chase had lived. "I admit we could be looking at some psycho who targeted them, but I also think he's someone the women knew. I'd wager they trusted him, and he used that to his advantage. From there, who knows? He probably utilizes something to incapacitate them, whether it be drugs or high amounts of alcohol," she said. They were still waiting on the tox results for Jackson. Rush, no rush. The process didn't move fast enough. "My guess, too. And I don't want to get you all worked up, but it bugs me that we can't find Eunice." She looked over at Terry, surprised by his admission. So often they were of conflicting opinions. But the fact that he was of the same mind as her on this subject wasn't reassuring. "Me too." She wasn't about to get into the fact that she'd felt someone watching her while in the park, or he'd shoot it down as nonsense quicker than she had. Chapter 32. The apartment complex where Joanna Chase had lived was modest and middle class, certainly nothing like the luxury of the condos in the Sunrise building. It also wasn't secured, so anyone could walk in off the street. There was a sheet of paper taped to the glass in the entrance saying that the manager, Roger Kimball, could be found in apartment 102. Madison and Terry went there, and she knocked. Silence. "Don't tell me he isn't home." She banged again, louder, longer. Footsteps padded toward the door. It was opened. "Yeah?" A man in his 50s trained his gaze over Madison, then Terry, and back to her. She held up her badge. "Detectives with the Stiles PD. We need access to Joanna Chase's apartment." "I'd need a warrant for that." Kimball started to close the door, and Madison inserted the tip of her shoe in there. "We have that." Terry stepped forward and held up his screen for him to see the signed warrant. "I didn't have time to print it out." They'd owe supporting documentation to the judge. A verbal warrant just gave them a pass to postpone the paperwork. Kimball leaned in and took a close look, eyes narrowed, forehead furrowed. He drew back. "Very well." He reached behind him and snatched a ring of keys off a hook. "Let's go." He took them to apartment 310 and unlocked the door. "I'll be back in my apartment should you need me." He dropped the key into Madison's palm. "Just please lock up before you leave." "You got it." She was relieved that the manager took the initiative to leave them alone. It often took some effort for that to happen. "Just a couple of questions before you go, though," she rushed out. The manager pivoted on a heel. "When did you last see Joanna Chase?" she asked. "Think it would have been Monday morning. I was in the lobby dealing with building maintenance, and she was headed to work. Or so I assumed." "What time was this?" Terry asked. "About 7:30 a.m. That would possibly fit her work schedule if she walked to Willow Properties and made a stop on the way for coffee or breakfast on the go. Most office employees started at 8:30 or 9. "Do you know if Joanna had any boyfriends?" "I saw her with guys before, but no repeats. Anything else?" "Not right now." But if you think of someone later, call me." She handed Kimball her card, and he left. Madison turned to Terry. "Notice anything about the manager?" "Not really." He never even questioned why we were interested in Chase or in seeing her apartment. "I wouldn't read too much into it. This isn't the nicest block or building. He might not want to get involved." Those words summed up one problem with the world. Most people were concerned only with their own affairs or when things personally impacted them. But Madison wondered about Kimball himself. Maybe he hadn't asked about their presence because he knew the answer. She'd pull a background on Kimball later, just for due diligence. The elevator dinged, and Officer Higgins unloaded and saluted them when he saw them in the hallway. He'd caught them just before they headed into the apartment. "Hey, Chief," she greeted him, smiling. "Hey." He was solemn, but she understood why. They were on the doorstep belonging to yet another young woman who was the victim of a horrendous crime. Brutally tortured, murdered, then her body mutilated. Some images were impossible to erase. Madison stepped inside, feeling the impact of the woman's death. It was heavy and suffocating, the sensation ever present that she was trespassing in a private, sacred space. The place was a studio. A pull-out couch served as Chase's bed, and the living room her bedroom. There was a rectangular coffee table, a flat-screen television, and a media stand with a soundbar. 2 stools at a counter designated her dining area. The galley kitchen was barely long enough to accommodate a fridge, stove, and dishwasher. It took little time to work through the apartment, and their efforts didn't turn up anything useful, at least on the surface, to their investigation. Various framed photographs in the apartment showed Joanna with her parents, also some with a couple of girlfriends. Joanna had a stunning smile and a star quality to her. Madison joined Terry in the kitchen area. "Time to speak with Chase's friends and see what they can tell us about her personal life." Terry shut the lower cabinet door that he'd been looking inside. Before he closed it, she'd seen a garbage bin in there with a coffee cup sitting on top with Ruby Bean's logo on it. "Yeah, and her workmates," Terry said. "Who, according to her parents, are one and the same. I just hope they can give us something to piece together her daily routines." Tara's friends weren't a whole lot of help in that regard. But we're also looking at 2 different people here. Jackson had money and chose to work for whatever reason. She worked at the diner, sure, but her schedule overall likely allowed for more flexibility than Joanna's. "You're assuming that about Jackson. We don't know how much money she gave away. We haven't seen her financials. She might have needed to work. I don't see her making herself destitute. She had the condo to maintain, too." Madison just nodded, the thought about Tara emptying her accounts being something that occurred to her when speaking with Christina Conrad. "But picking up where I was headed," Terry said. Chase held a steady job at the property management company. Set working hours, breaks, lunchtimes. Even Kimball knew from seeing her when he did on Monday morning that she was headed into work. She had predictability to her schedule. Her friends might be able to shed more details on it. Question is, was the killer familiar with the regularities in her schedule? Rhetorical, and a backhand serve to his simplification of piecing together a timeline. A text came into her phone, and it was from Richards, informing her that he'd emailed the autopsy report on Chase, or as he put it, Vic 2. The sight of that had acid gnawing on her gut. "It's Richards," she said to Terry. "He's emailing the autopsy report." Another chime. She looked, and it was a second text from Richards. 21 stab wounds, she said, reading it off. Same number of wounds as Jackson. And both correspond with their age. It was easier to dismiss this as a coincidence the first time around. But again? Does the number have special meaning to the killer? We should just be happy Chase wasn't stabbed 22 times. She didn't need to spell out the implication. If she had been, that could suggest their killer was keeping a tally of his victims. Suppose so. She checked her email, scanned down Richard's more detailed findings, and plucked out the highlights. Tox panel sent off. Still no absolute on the blade used for the stabbings or the bone sawing. It wouldn't matter how many times she'd repeat something like that. It would never roll off her tongue with grace and ease. "What are we missing, Terry?" He raked a hand through his hair, and each one filed in line, returning to where it had been before. "If only—" "I just don't know anymore," he said. His words landed as a boulder on her chest. His energy changed with his words, and the area surrounding him suddenly felt cooler. It was like his statement wasn't solely regarding her rhetorical question, but rather something existential. Terry went on. "These young women weren't chosen from the fringes of society. They held jobs, volunteered. One had a prestigious father, for goodness sake. They are missed by family, loved ones, and coworkers. And we still couldn't save them." The words tumbled out, the admission breaking her heart. He met her gaze. "I don't know if I can do this anymore." Her chest slowed on an exhale as a horrible feeling wormed through her. "Do what?" "This job, Madison. It takes too much out of a person, out of me." "What are you saying?" She wasn't sure she wanted his answer. "There's something I need to tell you. I should have told you a while ago." She suppressed her natural tendency to rush ahead. All she had to do was breathe and wait. "I've decided to take the sergeant's exam." His statement came out in a stream of words, carried on a single breath. You? She was stammering. It certainly wasn't what she'd expected he might say, and it left her speechless. "I'm sure this comes as a shock." She should have been able to assemble the clues. His recent camaraderie with the sergeant, Winston pointing things out to him, giving him more rope. Her detective mind must have just pushed all this aside to protect herself. You could say that. She imagined him as a sergeant. Set, reliable hours, which he would love. He'd be home every night for dinner with his wife and daughter. But there was one other thing he'd gain: security. Being off the street, he'd be at less risk of being hurt or worse. "Does this have to do with that killer holding a knife to your throat?" That didn't help. Her eyes burned with tears, and she turned, blinking them back. She was experiencing a flood of emotion: grief, anger, betrayal. The sergeant had alluded to Terry not being on her team. Now she knew why. He'd also chastised Terry the other day, not her. Again, it was all clear looking back. "Winston knows your plan?" "He does." "How long ago did you decide you were going to do this?" "A few weeks ago." She stopped talking. Hurt, feeling stabbed in the back. He'd kept this from her for weeks. That fact alone stung. She couldn't dwell on what this change would mean for her, how she'd lose Terry as her partner. The thought alone was unbearable. Chapter 33. Madison had planned to put off her appointment with her therapist. That was until Terry dropped his bomb about wanting to take the sergeant's exam. Now she viewed it as an opportunity to step back and truly start to process what he'd told her. While she spoke with Connor, Terry was going to follow up with the status of the warrant for the video from Jackson's condo building and pull a background on Kimball. They'd go together to visit Willow Properties, where Chase worked, either later today or tomorrow. Madison was in Connor's waiting room, anxiously tapping a foot. The other reason she came was guilt. Troy deserved someone who had their crap together. And that wasn't how she described herself before Terry's news, let alone after. What would her life even look like without him as her partner? And what if he became her boss? She could take the sergeant's exam herself, but her heart was in being a detective, no matter the tally of failures. She viewed the job as a challenge, and the drive to bring justice and provide closure was what kept her going. But she considered Terry's comments from the last few days, and he was right. This job was a constant revolving door of death, of the ugly side of humanity. The latter word was hardly suitable for most of what they witnessed. But it was in the small things, the warmth in a person's touch or embrace, that reminded her there was still good in the world. Even looking at how Tara Jackson, daughter of a wealthy man, chose a life of sacrifice as opposed to one of leisure, lifted Madison's spirits. Connor came out of the treatment room and smiled kindly. "Good afternoon, Madison. I'm ready for you." Madison got to her feet, suddenly wishing to run out of there. But that wasn't an option. She'd been seen and was at the point of no return, like an airplane flying over the ocean that had eaten up more than half its fuel. "Hi." Connor took a seat in her egg-shaped chair, legs crossed, back straight. Madison closed the door and dropped onto the couch across from her. The room was decorated in warm tones with little color. It suited Connor's personality, calm, soothing, and she had a maternal aura to her. Not that she was anything like Donna Knight. If she were, Madison wouldn't open her mouth for fear of judgment. And that was with their relationship in a better spot these days. Still, her mother was a therapy session, or several, for another day. "It's been a while since we've spoken," Connor said, free of judgment. "Work's been busy." "I'm sure it has been." Connor left it there, even though Madison was certain she'd know about the murders, at least of Tara Jackson's, from the news. But the therapist was good at letting Madison set the tone and direction for their discussions. When she didn't say anything, Connor asked, "What would you like to talk about today?" "I was actually going to cancel." Madison reached for the pillow that she'd initially shoved to the other end of the couch. She picked at the cording around its edges. A distraction Connor would see right through. Madison set the cushion back where it had been. "Why is that?" "Everything's fine now." Madison smiled, though the expression stopped short when she heard the use of the dreadful word. It took all of 3 seconds in Connor's presence. Connor smiled and scribbled in her notebook. "What's fine, Madison?" She angled her head slightly. "Well, I was having nightmares, but they've stopped." She'd grasp on to what she could. "That's good. What were these nightmares about?" Madison skimmed over the reoccurring theme about the mob seeking retribution. She didn't even touch on the faces that haunted her, the ones she couldn't save from the warehouse explosion. "In your waking hours, are you afraid the mafia is coming for you?" Connor asked once Madison finished speaking. She flushed hot at simply being asked. The feeling of being watched, needing to look over her shoulder. "I am." The admission didn't unburden her, like she thought it might. Rather, it reinforced her weakness, her vulnerability. And the latter was something she detested. "Have you talked to anyone else about this fear?" She looked at the pillow, refused the urge to hug it to her chest and fold into the couch. When Madison didn't answer, Connor said, "What about Troy? What does he say about these nightmares and your fears?" "He doesn't know about all of it. I just mentioned the nightmares, not what they're about." "That's a start." "I should tell him, but..." Madison instinctively twisted her engagement ring. "What is stopping you?" "I mean, they are just dreams, imaginings of my subconscious. Dreams can reveal a lot about our hopes and fears. You know what? I'm fine." And there was that word again. She made a move to get up, but settled back down when Connor angled her head, a knowing smile on her face. She'd read her like a book. Madison's instinct was to flee at the first twinge of discomfort. "Do you feel you have to be strong all the time?" Connor asked. Madison grabbed the pillow, shoved it under her arm, leaned on it. Connor's question struck deep. Why did she feel that need? Did it have something to do with her avoiding vulnerability at all costs? "It's not about that." Now I'm lying to myself. "What would you say prevents you from talking with Troy, sharing your fears?" She bristled, hating that admission was out, even in this safe environment. "I'm not afraid." "Not in control, then," Connor said, matter of fact. Madison met the therapist's gaze. "When you feel like you don't have control, do you feel weakened, vulnerable?" Madison's heart was picking up speed, and her arms were cold. "Possibly," she admitted through clenched teeth. "Yes, well, that's perfectly normal, Madison. None of us want to feel that way. Me especially." But Connor may have hit Terry's motivation to take the sergeant's exam on the nose, too. He'd felt loss of control when he could have died. But if he took the exam, he'd be taking back his power, his control, and removing himself from future threats. She was deflecting. I suppose so. How long have you been having the nightmares? They're over now, so... Connor played the silent card. A few months, Madison eventually said. And when did they stop? A couple of nights ago. Connor scribbled in her book again. Just because you're sleeping now, it doesn't mean that your mind is finished processing the inciting trauma at the root of these nightmares. What have you been doing to help yourself process it? Journaling? Meditation? Not as religious about that as I could be. Translation, not doing either at all. Even sitting with the emotions a few minutes a day can help you process your emotions, your fears. Fears. This time the words struck hard, and Madison bristled. Coming here to talk with me an hour here or there isn't enough, Madison. You need to put in the work. Madison had heard all that before and was certain she'd hear it again. Have you been doing anything to cope with these nightmares? To help yourself feel better? Madison wasn't sure she wanted to fess up to the drives in the wee hours. Once she did that, she suspected the conversation would snowball. Before she knew it, she'd be on the topic of Tara Jackson and Joanna Chase. How she failed to save them. Then stack Eunice on top of that. Madison? Connor gently encouraged. She decided what the hell and admitted to the drives, omitting Tara Jackson from the summation of her most recent outing. It sounds meditative. A subtle smile. I suppose it is. What does Troy think about these morning drives? I don't think he knows. He might, but I haven't told him. She cleared her throat. The rest of Madison's hour with Connor passed, at times painfully slow. She persevered, though. Even told Connor she'd journal more. She also made a renewed promise to herself to let Troy all the way in. Madison made it to the parking lot when her phone rang. Cynthia Baxter was on the caller ID. What you got? Something you're going to want to see. Chapter 34. Madison called Terry as she drove to the station, and he brought her up to speed. Kimball's background was clean. The warrant had come through for the security footage from the Sunrise building for Saturday night, and he'd sent that paperwork over to Silas Faulkner. The building manager was to get it forwarded to Cynthia immediately. Madison and Terry stepped into the lab, and Cynthia pointed to the large TV mounted on the wall. A paused video was on the screen, taken from the intersection nearest Skyline Diner from what she could tell. The timestamp in the bottom showed that it was from Monday at 12:30, when Joanna Chase's phone went dark. Tell me we have our killer's face. Adrenaline pumped through her. Not exactly. Let's just watch. Cynthia shook her head and smirked at Terry, then started the video. Pedestrian traffic was heavy. People went east, west, some entered the diner and others left. Who are we supposed to be watching? See, that's the thing. Who indeed? But I'm just going to point out one thing that flagged my attention. Cynthia paused the feed, walked up to the TV, and pointed at a silver truck. You called us urgently for that? Madison was lost on what her friend was seeing. Give yourself a second. Cynthia raised her eyebrows, but Madison was still lost. Terry didn't seem to be doing any better. Eventually, Cynthia said, Remember I ascertained it would be a truck that had the right type of tires? She clicked on the remote, and the screen split into two. The paused footage was on the left, a close-up of the tires and expanded view of the casted treads on the right. They're a match, Madison said. Do we have a plate number? No plate. He has glare covers, but it's a Ford F-150, a few years old. Make and model was good, but a license would lead them to the killer's door. Those covers are illegal. As if the killer would care. I doubt he's worried about a traffic ticket, Terry inserted. I know. The risk of being caught might be part of the high for him, Terry said. Satisfying his lust for blood isn't enough, she volleyed back. Terry held up his hands. I'm just saying. They held eye contact for a few seconds. They hadn't said much since he'd told her about his plans to advance rank and her taking the opportunity to escape to her therapist appointment. She was definitely a runner if it let her escape an uncomfortable emotional situation. Did you search for silver F-150s in styles? Yep, over 250 registrations for models aged between 3 and 5 years ago. No way to narrow that down either, Madison said, defeated. Though, actually, the man who bought the suitcase was pegged as being in his 20s. Eunice said mid-20s would be pushing it. Can you check if any of these trucks are registered to a 20-something male? Let me try that. Cynthia made the search. A few seconds later, she was shaking her head. It was worth a try. Is the guy from out of town? But Madison was puzzled by this one. She felt confident he was tied to the downtown core, but that didn't mean his truck was registered in Styles. Let's just say that's a dead end. I wish I could be of more help, but I still haven't showed you why I called. Madison perked up at that, as Cynthia brought up another picture. It was grainy, but it showed the truck's cab from the passenger side, and someone was in that seat. Madison squinted, angled her head this way and that, as if it would sharpen the image. Is that Chase? I think so. Right height, too. I did the measurements ahead of you coming, ahead of calling you. But she looks like her head is leaned back, Madison said. Looks like that to me, Cynthia responded. Possibly unconscious, Terry suggested. The killer gave her something to knock her out. Madison nodded. Can you salvage anything from the footage, from other angles, that show the driver clear enough to run through facial recognition databases? Unfortunately, there's nothing that could work. Madison punched a fist into the palm of her other hand. Just need one little freaking break here. She stared at the screen where it was frozen on the cab, and her eye caught something. Can you zoom in right there? She pointed to a spot on the dash just past Chase. Sure. Cynthia walked to her desk to do it, as the television was being fed from her computer. Madison looked back at the TV. 2 takeout coffee cups were in an aftermarket holder. She recognized the logo emblazoned on the side of them. Ruby Beans. Cynthia and Terry looked at her, puzzled. And that's a big deal because... Cynthia asked. Not sure if it's a big deal, but there was one of these cups in Chase's garbage at her apartment, Madison said. Right, and I'd say a lot of people downtown have the same addiction. Cynthia returned to the feed and pointed out several people walking by with their coffee cups in their hands. Huh. To me, this is further proof our killer is someone who frequents the downtown area or even lives there. He got that suitcase from a vagrant in Bradshaw Park. He tossed Jackson's tote in a dumpster a few blocks away from there, and he gets coffee at Ruby Beans. He could have bought her one and drugged it. That's why she's knocked out. Madison's mind drifted to Eunice, who seemed to have vanished. Where are you? I'm not sure we should get too excited about a coffee cup, Terry said. You saw one in Chase's garbage, to be sure, but we don't know if Jackson ever went to Ruby Beans. Yes, we do. Cynthia held a finger in the air. I saw her in other footage holding one. We have him. Madison let herself assimilate that. Close, anyway. She backpedaled. Now we can tie this mystery man, Chase and Jackson, to Ruby Beans. Right, but not when, Terry said. Chase and Jackson would need to go at the same time as our killer. We need to find out when that might have been. Or simply focus on whether the women went with any regularity, Madison pointed out. Terry nodded. Correct. They already had their hands on Jackson's phone records, including GPS history, but even if it showed her in the vicinity of Ruby Beans, it didn't mean she'd gone inside. She could have just been passing by, and with her frequenting the downtown area, she'd pass the coffee shop several times a day. We start with Chase. As you pointed out before, she'd have a predictable schedule. Her friends and colleagues at Willow Properties might be able to confirm if she hit Ruby Beans at the same time. Don't want to step on toes, Cynthia said, But as long as you are discussing leads, what about Skyline Diner? Maybe they deserve a closer look. They're customers and employees. Both Jackson's and Chase's phones were last online there. We've thought of that, Madison said. Except Tara Jackson's phone going offline there may very well have been coincidental. She actually wasn't missing until after a shift at the library and leaving Gabe Proctor on Saturday. Another thought, Terry started. We theorized before that our killer elicited trust from the young women. That doesn't necessarily entail a relationship. A few encounters might have been enough. Something routine. Let's try to figure one out for Joanna Chase. Madison moved toward the door. Cynthia, just one thing, Terry said. You should be getting an email with video footage from the Sunrise building. And I'm doing what with that? Cynthia asked. It should be of the lobby, he clarified. We're wanting to see if it shows Jackson coming home on Saturday, whether she left again or was captured on video with someone. I'll keep an eye out for the email and inform you once I get it. Madison followed Terry out of the lab. They were leaving with fresh leads, ruby beans and the silver pickup. Still, it felt like they were battling a strong current to catch up with their killer. If only they could discover that magic bullet that would let them get ahead of him. Chapter 35. By the time Madison and Terry entered the lobby for Willow Properties, they had 15 minutes before the place closed. Madison held up her badge to the receptionist, a pretty and perky 20-something. By this point, it was likely everyone here knew that Joanna Chase had been murdered. Though the grisly details were kept out of the news, just as they had been with Tara Jackson. We need to speak with Joanna Chase's boss. We're Detectives Knight and Grant. The woman repeated as much into the phone's receiver, while Madison let the words sink in. Detective Grant. Soon it would be Sergeant. It was possible the concept would become easier to accept with repetition. Yet she doubted that. As competent as she was on her own, Terry had been by her side for more than 8 years. He kept her grounded and challenged her. Both were things she needed. The receptionist placed the receiver back in its cradle. You can go back. Follow that hallway, first door on the right. She gestured the directions as she gave them. The manager's name? Terry asked. Neville French. Actually, before we go, is there anything you could tell us about Miss Chase's routines? Did she go to the same place for morning coffee or breakfast, lunch? The question might be seen as leading, but Madison didn't name names. The woman worried her bottom lip, as if she were unsure whether to respond. It might help our investigation into her death, Terry encouraged. At the mention of Chase's demise, the woman sniffled and snatched a tissue from a nearby box. She dabbed the end of her nose. I can't believe she's dead. You worked together for long? Madison asked. For the 8 months I've been here. She'd be able to see Chase's comings and goings, including any visitors she may have had. Did she ever have anyone stop by to see her? Boyfriends or girlfriends? She could have had friends from outside the office that Chase's parents hadn't known about. No one came here, but she'd take lunch with Cora McKenzie sometimes. Cora was one of the friends' names they got from Chase's parents. They'd eventually speak with her and see what she might tell them. But no boyfriends? Madison bit back the urge to add, with a silver truck? None that I saw or heard about, and we didn't exactly talk about our personal lives. Anyone here who Joanna was close to besides Cora? Madison expected to hear the other name Chase's parents had given them. Excuse me. A man stepped into view. He was graying around the temples and wearing a well-tailored suit. Can I help you with something? The receptionist tensed and started moving her mouse around as if she hadn't just been conversing with them. I'm Detective Knight, and this is Detective Grant. I assume you're Neville French? I am. French peacocked his stance and clasped his hands in front of himself. Closed off, possibly defensive. We have some questions about Joanna Chase. Yes, as I told Lindy. He shot daggers at the receptionist. She was to send you back. This way. He pivoted and took them into the room on the right. It was a sizable office with a nice view of downtown. "You can close the door behind you." French gestured a hand toward Terry as the man slipped behind a maple desk. Terry got the door and joined Madison. She was seated in a chair facing French. Her partner dropped into the one next to her. "What would you like to know?" he asked, drawing back into his chair. First impressions, French was a man who used his position of authority to control and intimidate. But he would soon find out he held no power over her or Terry. The fact that he'd opened the conversation by asking a question showed a desire to direct the narrative. His posture, leaned back in his chair, and facial expression conveyed annoyance and impatience. "To start, we're very sorry for your loss." Usually she was the one rushing ahead, but with this man, she was inclined to take her time. "I appreciate you saying that." His hardened exterior softened as he acknowledged the condolence. Terry asked, "How long did Joanna work for Willow Properties?" "A year. She came to us right after graduation and was on the fast track to promotion. I have no doubt she'd have been office manager within the next year." "You knew that was her ambition?" Madison asked for the purpose of ferreting out the boundaries of their relationship, whether it had been strictly professional or crossed the line. "She never made a secret of that. Not from our first interview with her." "So it was strictly professional between the two of you?" Madison was reading that French could have been overcompensating with the guarded body language for a reason besides discomfort at speaking with police. He pulled on the knot of his necktie and sawed a finger back and forth behind it. "I probably shouldn't say." "Then you were involved romantically," she said. "It's not what you might think. A young, impressionable woman comes to work and the manager takes advantage of her ambition." "Huh, it seems you've given it some thought," Madison fired back, stiffening. "It's no secret these days that the perception is about a boss dating a subordinate. But Joanna was a strong, independent woman. In fact, she made the first move. It's not like she's around to verify that. Being all for women's rights, advancement, and equality, this subject was a touchy one for her." "I wish she was." He stopped talking there, his mouth pinched, his chin trembling. "Were you exclusive?" she asked, though she was eager to get to their original purpose for coming here. "I was in love with her. Not exactly sure how she felt. We never discussed our relationship in so many words, but I was faithful to her." "What would you say if we told you we know she went on a date with another guy?" They already knew from Proctor that he'd gone out with Chase. "What is there to say? As you pointed out, it's not like we can ask her. And I suppose what I'm about to say won't go over well. Try us." 2 words, and they challenged. "I did see her with another guy, laughing and flirting." "And where was this?" Terry asked. "In the hall outside her apartment. She batted him on the chest just before she opened the door. Then they both went inside." "Huh, that must have made you feel like crap." She hadn't expected to find a murder suspect here, but that was turning around. "When was this?" "Not this past weekend, the Saturday before. I had dropped by to surprise her. I ended up with the surprise." "Did she tell you who he was?" Terry asked. "I never confronted her about it." "So you did nothing?" Madison found that hard to believe. She'd been cheated on in the past, and shock had saved her from strangling her then-fiancé and his tramp. It didn't stop her from throwing his ass to the curb, though. "I didn't kill her, if that's what you're implying," French scowled. "Was Joanna on any dating apps?" Madison asked. "I'd hope not, but I don't know for sure." She leaned forward. "Where were you on Monday from noon until 6 in the evening?" "Monday?" "Uh-huh." "I was here working on finalizing a contract." "Can anyone corroborate that fact?" Madison fired back. "A dozen people besides myself. We were all working on it." 13 of you and 1 contract? She was skeptical. "There are a lot of legalities to iron out and double checks, triple checks. We'll need everyone's names. Speaking with them would be time-consuming but necessary. If French was their killer and she let him go and someone else wound up dead, She'd never forgive herself. Her phone beeped with a message, but she'd read it when she was done here. "I'll get that for you, no problem." "Good," Madison said. "We'll also need to ask that those who worked on that contract with you and those who worked directly with Joanna Chase stay until we've had a chance to talk with them." His gaze drifted behind them, and Madison turned to see he was consulting the clock. "Give me a minute," he said, and pressed a finger to his desk phone. The receptionist answered over the speaker, so it must have been an intercom button he'd pushed. He listed off several names and added, "I need you to make sure they don't go until the detectives have spoken with them." "A lot have already left for the day." "Okay, well, stop the rest from leaving." "Will do." "There, that's taken care of." French regarded Madison, let his gaze dance over to Terry. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" Madison had used the time he was on the phone to pull up a photograph of Tara Jackson. "Do you know her?" He looked at her screen and nodded. "Yes, from recent news stories. One about her donating to the hospital and the other about her murder." "But you didn't know her?" Madison asked. "No, and I don't like the insinuation, detective." She put her phone away. "I don't care if you like it or not. I'm sure you can appreciate, as a man who professed to love Joanna, that my partner and I are trying to find the person who killed her." "Seems you think Joanna's killer also murdered that other young woman." She neither confirmed nor denied. French flopped back into his chair. "I'll help however I can." "Since you admitted to knowing Joanna well, what was her regular routine, say from waking up to getting to work?" she asked. "She sets her alarm for 5:30, hits snooze once." If French planned to catalog every move, they might be here a while. She started softly tapping a foot under the table. French went on. "Goes for a run, grabs a large macchiato from Ruby Beans, comes back, showers, and heads to work around 7:30. She gets in at about 8:15. "What about breakfast?" Terry asked. "She wasn't one for breakfast, but she often ate lunch at Skyline Diner. She loved their Philly cheesesteak sandwich." Now, Terry looked at Madison. He felt the link was at the diner, and she might have been closed-minded on the topic. It had just as much possibility of being where the women met their killer as Ruby Beans, or any place else downtown, for that matter. Madison and Terry finished up with French. They went on to verify his alibi with 2 of the 12 people left in the office. They also spoke with 2 people who had worked closely with Joanna. One of these was the friend Jolene Welch. The other was an older woman who had worked at Willow Properties for 15 years. Neither had anything to offer that advanced the investigation. If Joanna Chase had been on a dating app, she'd kept that from Jolene Welch. Cora McKenzie might know, but she was one of the employees to run out the door at 5:50. By the time they stepped outside, Madison's phone told her it was after 6, and there was a text from Troy with a link. "Estelle found a beautiful house. Let me know what you think. And how are things with your therapist?" She avoided the question and clicked on the link. When its spec page loaded and she saw the street view, she was catapulted back in time. The house had been. Her heart swelled with excitement, and she keyed a response. "Perfect. Let's see it." "It's possible Joanna Chase flirted with and trusted the wrong man," Terry said. "Whether it was someone from a dating app, if we find out she was on one, or someone she met in person." She heard Terry speaking, and his words were somewhat getting through. "Did you hear me?" he prompted. She nodded and held the phone for him to look at the house. "And I'm looking at what exactly?" "My new home with Troy." He leaned in. "Looks nice. Now, a response to what I said?" She pocketed her phone. "If we can track Cora McKenzie down at home, she might be able to tell us if her friend was on a dating app. And you're right about Skyline Diner, by the way. It's just as likely a meeting spot as Ruby Beans, considering Chase often had lunch there." "Are you good to wait until tomorrow for all that? I kind of promised Annabelle I'd be home for dinner tonight." "I'll take care of it on my own. That's fine." "I would go tomorrow." She was smiling. "I meant what I said, and I really mean that it's fine." I'll drive us back to the station and you get headed home. Thanks. Don't mention it. Her phone beeped again on the way to the department car, and Troy confirmed he'd requested Estelle book a viewing for tomorrow night. She messaged back that she hoped he was home because she should be within the hour. Chapter 36. The next morning, Madison updated Terry on her stops the previous night while she drove them to Ruby Beans. Bernie Atchison from Skyline recognized Joanna Chase as a regular customer, but he and his staff on duty hadn't noticed her with a man or observed any paying her undue attention. Dead end all around there. But Cora McKenzie, she's a different story. She says that she was Joanna's best friend. She knew all about Joanna's affair with her boss and said she wasn't the faithful type. Rather, she described Joanna as being flighty when she wasn't at work. And the golden takeaway, Joanna was also on Tethered, the same dating app that Tara Jackson was on. Madison would never forget being witness to Cora's grief. She bawled and blamed herself, repeatedly saying, "If only I went for lunch with her on Monday." Did she have any names for us? Unfortunately, no. And without Chase's phone or the ability to log into her profile, we're in the dark. Before they had left Willow Properties yesterday, they had found out Chase worked on a laptop, but it wasn't in her office or apartment, so presumably she took it with her when she left for lunch on Monday. Although, I could have Cynthia see if there's any way Tethered will open their files to us. That could get us names. Nah, I don't see them cooperating without a warrant, and I don't see one getting approved. Not yet, anyway. We need more to support why these men would be suspect. It's too bad we didn't find a laptop or tablet. If she'd used them to get into the app, they might autofill the username and password, and we'd be in. That would make our lives too easy. As we brought up before, we could take a hard look at the men Tara Jackson dated, see if they also knew Chase. Definitely think it's an avenue worth pursuing at this point. Madison pulled into a spot in front of the coffee shop and stuck some coins in the parking meter. She led the way inside Ruby Beans and inhaled appreciatively. It wasn't Starbucks, but they offered much of the same. She'd be getting a caramel cappuccino for the road once they finished up with what needed to be done here. The coffee shop was bustling with activity. 2 lines stretched from the counter to the door. They weaved through the crowd. At the front, she excused herself to a male customer who was wearing a suit, likely an employee in one of the offices downtown. "Styles PD," she told him as she held up her badge. This prompted a flashback to April when she'd done the same thing in a Starbucks. Just before all hell had broken loose. The man shuffled back about 6 inches and gestured for her to go ahead. Madison turned to the cashier and held up a picture of Tara Jackson. "Do you recognize her?" The cashier was in her early 20s, with curly blonde hair that reached her jawline and wore diamond stud earrings. "She looks kind of familiar." Madison had shown her the photo of Tara with long black hair and exchanged it now for one of Tara with a blonde bob. "Her?" "Yeah, I recognize her." She moved her body, not so subtly inferring she'd like Madison to step aside so she could get on with helping the next customer in line. Cynthia had found Tara Jackson on CCTV with one of their cups, but that didn't confirm she'd stopped in here with any sort of regularity. "Does she come here every day?" "Yes." Impatient and doing nothing to hide that fact. "At a set time?" If they could just establish a pattern. "She'd come in around 9:30. Now please, step aside. Next," she called out, poking her head so she could see past Madison. "Actually, I'll take an extra large caramel cap. You want anything, Terry?" "I'm good." "That's all," Madison told the woman. She sighed but punched in the order, wrote Madison's name on a cup, and collected her money. Madison moved down the counter, Terry too, and the corner offered a pocket of calm amid the rest of the chaos. "So Chase came here around 7 and Jackson around 9:30, Terry summarized. "Is our killer a coffee addict?" Madison remembered the man in the suit. Could be someone who works downtown. Saying that was like tossing a dart, hoping it would stick to the board. "Caramel cap for Madison?" the barista called out as he set the cup down on the counter. She snapped it up and headed toward the exit. On the way, she met the gaze of a man in his 20s who was sitting at a table. There was something vaguely familiar about him, and she tried to reestablish eye contact. He seemed to be looking anywhere but at her. Then it clicked into place why she recognized him. He was one of the men from the dating app. She started toward him, but he jumped up and bolted for the door. "You've got to be kidding me!" She looked at the ceiling, flailed her free arm. Terry was off. Seriously, what would she do without him? He was the runner, she was not. She took a calm sip of her cappuccino, then made her way through nosy onlookers. She stepped outside to find that Terry had a grip on the man. Go Terry! The jackrabbit was panting from his little run and shrugged, pulling on Terry's arms. "Can you let me go?" "If you don't run again," Terry told him. "I won't." The guy clenched his teeth. "Okay." Terry let him go, hesitantly. "What's your name?" Madison asked, remembering only his face from the list Cynthia had made of names and their associated headshots. "Vance Newman." That was it. "Why did you run?" "It was the way you were looking at me." He didn't have sandy blonde hair, but the rest of Eunice's description could work, and hair could be dyed. "What do you have to hide, Mr. Newman?" "Nothing." "Huh. This guy had dated Tara Jackson," Madison said to Terry. "One time, 2 weeks ago, and that's the last time I saw her, I swear." "You seem rather defensive for an innocent guy," Terry said. "Don't twist this around." He waved an arm in a circle. "Police do that. I've seen it firsthand." "Oh, you have?" She'd pulled his background with the rest of them, and it hadn't shown a criminal record, but it would seem Newman had some story to tell. "I'm thinking we should go down to the station and have a talk." "Nope, no, that's not necessary." "Seems to me that would be our decision." Madison wriggled a finger between herself and Terry. "Sorry, just please believe me. I'm not your guy." Madison crossed her arms. "And what guy is that?" You know." Madison and Terry remained silent. Eventually, Newman said, "I read that she was murdered. Her body recently found." His chest was heaving, and his cheeks were flushed a bright red. "But, as I said, you're looking at the wrong guy here." "How well did you know Tara Jackson?" Madison asked, the question designed to throw him off and calm him down. His shoulders relaxed. "Just the one date. I'd have no reason to kill her, or that other girl." He ran his index finger under his nose and sniffled. "What other girl?" she countered. He rolled his eyes. "Joanna, someone. I read about her online, too." It was starting to feel like everyone was current on the news these days. He came across like he didn't know Joanna Chase, but he'd been the one to bring up her name. "Did you ever date Joanna Chase?" Madison brought up her photo on her phone and held her screen toward him. Newman looked at the picture and shook his head. "No." A simple, direct answer accompanied by comfortable eye contact. He was telling the truth. Still, she asked, "Where were you Saturday night?" "It's obvious you think I killed them, but what reason would I have to kill Tara and a girl I've never even met?" "Sometimes it takes very little provocation to kill, and murderers have been known to target strangers," Madison said calmly. "Not me. And why would I kill Tara? We had one date and didn't even hit it off. We settled our tab for dinner and went our separate ways as quickly as possible." She could push him on the alibi, but she'd go another route first. When she'd looked at his information before, it had been an overview. Since then, they found out about the silver Ford F-150. "We're going to need to run a background on you, Mr. Newman, before we let you go." She nudged her head to Terry, who grabbed one of Newman's arms to corral him to the department car. "What are you doing?" "I told you what we're doing. It won't take long." She gave him a pressed smile. "Fine, do it. Run whatever reports you want on me. You'll see that I don't have a record." "Yet you're awful skittish of the police. You also said police twist things around a moment ago," she said. "Why?" "I saw what the system did to my mother." "And what did she do?" she asked. and it earned a glare. Nothing. She fought back when my dad was beating her, and she wound up behind bars for a spell. But it was self-defense, he hissed. If that story was true, Madison agreed. All right, give us a minute. Terry hung outside the vehicle holding Newman, while she ducked in and brought up reports on him. No registered vehicles. In fact, he didn't even have a driver's license. No matter how badly she wanted to close this investigation, Newman probably wasn't their guy. She got out of the car and stood in front of Newman. Tara was found in a unique manner. What was that? Newman's eyes beaded with tears. I have no idea. She held eye contact with him, then decided she believed him. You can let him go, Detective Grant. Terry did, and Newman rubbed his arm as if Terry had hurt him. See, I told you. Bye. She waved at Newman, and he wasted no time leaving. She filled Terry in on the lack of a license and vehicle. Yeah, I didn't think he did it. Guy was trembling. The killer we're after wouldn't scare easily. If Terry's words were to make her feel better about releasing Newman, they did half the job. It added emphasis to the fact the person they were after was truly a monster. Let's track down the other guys Tara dated. There's a chance we'll land on something that'll blow the case wide open. Works for me. Chapter 37. Madison slipped behind the wheel of the department car. Before we go back to the station, let's make a stop at Bradshaw Park. To look for Eunice again? Yeah, we can show her Proctor's picture and those of the men Tara dated. That's if we can find her. It was still niggling for Madison that she hadn't been able to find the woman, and the uncertainty didn't lead her thoughts anywhere pleasant. She might have moved to another area of the city. Terry put on his seatbelt. I think we'd both like to believe that. I've given it more thought, and she's not exactly our killer's type. He might have seen her as a loose end. Maybe he saw her talking with us. She merged the department car into traffic. Faster to drive to Bradshaw Park from here than to walk. Oh, you think he's watching us? Her words had gotten ahead of her, but now she had no choice but to defend herself. Why not? As we've touched on before, this killer knows how to manipulate people. We think he got Tara and Joanna to trust him. To do that, he's most likely observant and intelligent. Well, hopefully you're wrong about this woman's fate, and we find her today. She looked over at him. Trust me, this is one time I want to be wrong. Madison put her focus back out the windshield and pulled them into the lot for Bradshaw Park. They headed to the vagrant encampment and found the regulars milling about, some huddled together and talking. Anyone see Eunice? She asked as she walked, and Terry did the same. No one answered with words, but most shook their heads. Some looked at them blankly. Go away, detectives! It was a woman talking from behind her. Madison drew a deep breath, hoping to conjure some patience, because she'd recognize that voice anywhere. Claws. She slowly turned. We're looking for Eunice. I ain't hard of hearing. Neither is anyone here. Your type isn't welcome. She squared her shoulders. We're concerned about her welfare. You have no need to be. Chills ran down Madison's arms, despite her logical mind being ready to dismiss anything this woman had to say. She was certain Claus was about to share some vision she'd had. And why is that? Maybe Eunice had moved on to another area of the city. Surely street people did that. It wasn't like they were tied to one place. I saw her leave the park with some man. In real life? Madison wanted to make sure her seeing wasn't referring to some vision. Yes. When was this? Monday night. After you were here making trouble. Go. She lifted an arm, pointing toward the exit of the park. Answer these 2 questions. Madison wasn't being pushed around by anyone, let alone this woman. What did he look like? Good looking. About his height. She nudged her head toward Terry. Hair color, build? Terry asked. Claus smiled. Ah, you do have a voice. Madison snapped her fingers to get the woman's focus back on track. She narrowed her eyes and said, "He had light brown hair." "Could it be sandy blonde?" Madison countered. "Sure." "Age?" 20-something. Shit. Did she go with him willingly or under duress? She was leaning on him like she was drunk, but also counting money as she walked past the lot of us. She flailed a hand to the crowd, most of whom turned away, as if scolded for eavesdropping. Like she was drunk. He must have drugged her. Was she drinking anything? She had a coffee in her hand. Joanna Chase had appeared unconscious next to a Ruby Beans coffee cup. Where was it from? I didn't pay attention to that. Madison still suspected the killer must have laced the coffee. Chase's and Eunice's from the sound of it. Where are her things? Claus drew a hand over the encampment. Distributed among all of us. Son of a bitch. He has her. I just told you that. I was talking to my partner. Do any of these men look familiar? Madison scrolled through the 6 photos. The 5 guys from the dating app and Proctor for good measure. No. Claus barely looked at the screen. Madison shoved it in her face. Give it a go. Claus tightened her jaw and narrowed her eyes. I said no. Fine, we'll ask everyone around here. Do whatever you want. Your time to waste. Madison turned her back on Claus and walked off with Terry. He drugged Eunice, Joanna Chase, probably Tara too. Sounds like it. And Monday night, Chase was probably already dead when he came for Eunice. This guy is escalating. This really isn't good, Terry. She had this burning in her gut, telling her they really might be too late to save Eunice. It's not. Now we could run around here all day flashing those pictures, though I hate to say it, but... Terry said. Let me guess. You think it would be a waste of time? Terry nodded. Until we know if any of them even have a silver F-150, I do. That's easy enough to look up and could save us a lot of time, just like you did with Newman. You're right. Though she could argue any of them could have borrowed the vehicle from someone they knew. In that vein, they already knew that Proctor didn't have a vehicle. That could stand to rule him out, though it was too soon to conclude that as far as she was concerned. A few beats, then Terry said, Even if the killer did take her, this isn't your fault. It is our fault, Terry, no matter how you frame it. We vowed to protect and serve, and we just keep failing people. We were at the park doing our jobs. If the killer saw us then, well, it couldn't be helped. She wished she could nonchalantly brush away all responsibility. We are going to have another death on our heads unless we can save her. Not that she had one clue where to begin, but thinking they stood any chance of saving her was more motivating than succumbing to defeat. You're taking this upon yourself when your hands aren't the ones with blood on them. Says you, the man who's bailing on me. And why? Because the job is too dark. That's basically what you said. Terry's mouth, which had been opened as if he were going to say something, snapped shut. I just wish you would have talked with me about this. My decision to take the sergeant's exam doesn't concern you. Of course it does, she snapped back. We've been partners for years and entrusted our lives to each other for how many shifts? She felt broken at the thought of him moving on, not just betrayed and abandoned. He met her gaze. You're right. I should have talked to you about it. Damn right you should have. He cringed at her word choice. She wasn't exactly in the mood to apologize. I'm going to miss you too, Knight. But I haven't left yet, and there's still the matter of needing to pass the exam. Hope for us yet, then. We know you're not good at those. We do? Oh, yeah, sure we do. She smiled at him, then shook her head. She had no idea whether he excelled at written tests or not. Even if I pass, who knows how long it will be until a spot opens up. True, that could take a while. She resumed walking, him beside her. If you do pass, though, you'll do the job proud. She couldn't look at him when she said this, and an ache burrowed in her chest. "Thanks, Maddie." Nothing much more was said on the way to the department car. She was deep in thought about how things never stayed the same. They were constantly changing, and often when it was least expected and in unimagined ways. But somehow, she'd get through whatever the future held. Logically, even if Terry became a sergeant, he'd always be a part of her life. Chapter 38. A quick check using the computer in the department car ruled out the other 4 guys from the dating app. None of them had a Ford F-150. "It doesn't mean they didn't borrow one from a friend," she said to Terry, even though they'd been back at the station for a couple of hours working through Tara Jackson's phone records. "We need something more definitive," was all he said, barely breaking from reading the reports. They had approval for the financials, and these they had forwarded to Jackson's and Chase's banks. Time to wait. As Madison worked, her mind was preoccupied with Eunice walking off with that man. She picked up a printed photo of Tara Jackson and one of Joanna Chase and held them side by side. Long, dark hair, high cheekbones, an oval-shaped face. The same age, too. Coincidentally or not, that corresponded with the number of stab wounds. With Jackson and Chase, the killer adhered to a type. Eunice broke that mold and was entirely different. Madison surmised the killer targeted her because he saw her as a loose end. But there was another way Eunice differed from the 2 young women. Eunice wouldn't be missed the same way. Did that suggest the killer liked to inflict widespread pain, branching beyond his victims to their loved ones and others who might be affected by the loss? Was it a boost to his ego when he murdered those held in high esteem by the community? Even more so when he got away with it? What if he had killed prior to Tara Jackson? And if so, how many times? This hypothetical was something she'd wished to continue denying, but she wasn't sure she could anymore. He was quick and rash to act. In the span of a few days, 2 murders and 1 disappearance tied back to him. There were no hesitation marks to his incisions, indicative of a calm hand. A blade wielded by someone with experience. That indicated he had potentially gotten away scot-free for some time. What could she do to stop him? Could the secret be in the past, rather than with the recent cases? "Hey, are you still looking at the reports? I'm not doing all the work here," Terry said. His interruption jolted her. She was quite sure she'd been right on the edge of an epiphany. Now it was gone. "I'm working, but..." "Uh-huh. Did you realize just how similar the 2 young women look?" "Thought we'd been over that before." She disregarded his cavalier response and held up the pictures so they were facing him. They could have been sisters. "I see it." She set the photos back on her desk as her cell phone rang. "Detective Knight." "You'll want to see something right away." It was Cynthia. "I've heard that before." "We'll be right there." Madison ended the call and shot to her feet. "Sin needs us in the lab," she told Terry. Madison and Terry found Cynthia in the lab, remote in hand again. "More TV to watch and me without popcorn," Terry said dryly. Madison nudged him in the shoulder, but ended up pulling a Hershey's bar out of a pocket. "I have a snack. Not that I could stomach food at the moment." She went to put the chocolate away. Cynthia closed the distance between them as if she'd glided across the floor on skates. "Oh, no, you don't. I'll take that." She snatched the candy from Madison's hand. "Hey!" Cynthia rubbed her belly, though it was barely a bump at this point. "Pregnant, eating for 2, and I have a craving." She set the remote on the table, tore off the wrapping from the Hershey's bar, and chomped off a big bite. She moaned and shut her eyes. "Ugh, yes, that's what I'm talking about." Madison was laughing. Terry looked away, likely due to his aversion to people talking with their mouth full. Fair enough, though, as Madison could see now how it wasn't entirely attractive. "You going to live?" Madison asked her friend. "I will now. So will everyone else. Thanks, by the way." She held up the half-masticated chocolate bar. That took her all of 3 seconds. Don't mention it. She'd need to hit a vending machine for a replacement. So, what do we need to see? Asking felt reminiscent of yesterday. This. Cynthia folded the wrapper over the bit of remaining chocolate and set it on the table, exchanging it for the remote. It's loaded up already. Footage from the lobby at the Sunrise building. She clicked play and said, "You're not going to believe it." Madison pulled her gaze from Cynthia to the television. The timestamp was for Saturday night at 6 p.m. It showed Tara Jackson, long black hair, unlocking the main doors of the building and walking toward the elevator. She was dressed in shorts and a t-shirt, a light pink tote over her arm. She couldn't figure out what had Cynthia excited about what she was seeing. "I see this was 6 o'clock, the early end of the TOD window. Am I missing something?" "Nope, just wanted to set the stage." She forwarded the video, stopping when the timestamp showed a few minutes to 8. A man had entered the front doors and was standing next to the intercom buttons. Madison's focus was torn between his face and what he had in his hands. "He's carrying the yellow canvas suitcase Tara Jackson was found in. He showed up at her condo?" She felt faint. He certainly must have been someone Tara had trusted. "He has sandy blonde hair, about my height," Terry said. "Same as the man described by Eunice. He also fits the one Claus saw walking off with Eunice. Maybe if she adopted a mantra, 'She's alive and I can save her.' Then if she repeated it enough and believed it, her wish had to come true. After all, wasn't that how affirmations worked?" "Claus?" Terry and Cynthia chorused. "That homeless psychic woman who assaulted me last year." As if Terry didn't remember. "I didn't realize you had a pet name for her," Terry said. She could have sworn she'd said the name before, but all the same. "A pet name implies tender feeling. Trust me, there isn't any there." But back to business. "He looks young, early 20s like Tara and Joanna. Cynthia, can you get a close-up or clear shot of his face?" "I can and have. I even have it running through a few facial recognition databases already." "You're the best." Madison couldn't pry her eyes from the screen. This was their first real look at the killer. He was a good-looking guy. He was dressed in blue jeans and a fitted t-shirt showcasing biceps that certainly saw regular time at a gym. Can we tell if he pushes the button for Tara's apartment? It would just lend more proof to her letting him up. "Ahead of you there, too. And absolutely." I had zoomed in when watching before. Madison swallowed a mouthful of bile. Tara had buzzed up the man who had brutally murdered her. The video continued to play, and she watched as he was let through the secured door into the lobby. "Just look at how he walks, his body language. He's relaxed, confident, casual even," Madison said, sharing her observations. "You wouldn't be able to tell he's intending to kill someone at all," Terry agreed. She looked at him. "Just a bit ago, I was thinking how the wounds and cuts showed no hesitation. And now I see him here moving around. He really is comfortable." Cynthia forwarded the video, stopping when the timestamp landed on 11:30. "Look at this." The man was leaving with a suitcase in one hand and Tara Jackson's pink tote in the other. No sign of Tara herself, but it wasn't hard to deduce where she was. "I did some calculations, which I won't bore you with," Cynthia said. "But he is carrying an additional 100 pounds. That's roughly what Tara Jackson weighed, accounting for 10 to 13 pounds of blood loss." The last part was said solemnly, and the room fell silent. Just when Madison thought she'd seen all the ugly the world could offer, she got saddled with this deviant. To be faced with someone so full of hatred while on the surface calm and put together, it was unsettling. The smell of cleaner. He killed her in her apartment, and she let him up. Repetition didn't make it easier to reconcile. Then he just walks out the front door with her. Terry stated the obvious, likely trying to get it to sink in, too. And he took her tote, devices, the wig. Why? Could be as simple as doing it to throw off the investigation. Even if we looked in her apartment, we wouldn't think she was killed there. Sin, you and your team need to process Jackson's entire place, Madison said, clinging to the business side of the job, or she'd slip into the dark abyss. Starting in the bathroom, Terry inserted, and when both women looked at him, he continued. It would be the easiest place to contain and flush all the blood. Ahead of you. I already sent Mark over. I'll join him soon. There was nothing to add to that. The callousness of the act hurt her heart. They weren't after a human this time. They were after the devil. Chapter 39. Madison and Terry returned to their desks, while Cynthia headed out to join Mark at Tara's apartment. They'd go to Joanna Chase's place after that. Cynthia had called the building management, though, and was told they didn't have working surveillance cameras on the door. Cynthia said that she'd have Sam check on the progress of the facial rec database searches and notify them of any results, favorable or dead end. Madison dropped into her chair, the photos of Tara and Joanna still on her desk, staring up at her. They deserve justice, and the man who had killed them wouldn't stop until she and Terry made him. But would prison balance the scales of justice? Honestly, the world would be a better place with him in the ground. We need to catch this guy, Terry. Goes without saying, but yes. He'd become quiet and withdrawn since they left the lab, but she couldn't blame him. She accepted the world was home to evil people who loved to kill and had no qualms about doing so. But to see a person carrying out a body in a suitcase was tough to assimilate. Making it worse, he'd walked in there with intent, suitcase in hand, premeditation blatantly obvious. He's a planner, she said. Organized. I'd guess he lives the murder in his mind several times before he acts. Agreed. He must have had at least a few encounters with Jackson for her to let him up to her condo. The same familiarity was probably there with Chase, too. All the while, he was fantasizing about killing them. Well, we have his face now. Let's get out there and see if we can spot him. Your suggestion is to walk around downtown in the hopes of bumping into him? Not all of downtown, primarily near the diner and Ruby Beans. There's also the bars and restaurants Tara went to with her friends. Terry shook his head. Not doing it. Besides, if he's watching us like you think he is, he's not going to get close. Maybe you're right. He angled his head. Give this one to me. I am right. But as you said, we do have his picture. We can return to Bradshaw Park and talk to your friend again. See if she can ID him as who walked off with Eunice. Claus, she muttered. Right. Though if she's going down on the record, we'll need her legal name. She'll always be Claus to me. Let's go pay her a visit. She got up. Won't she be so happy you're back? Yeah, the mutual dislike is obvious, but what you gonna do? They went over to Bradshaw Park and found Claus pretty quickly. What the hell are you doing back here? Claus made a dramatic show of looking up to the cloudless sky. You recognize any of these men? Madison showed her a small array of photographs that included their suspect. Then, if it came up at the trial, a defense attorney wouldn't claim she'd fed her the answer. In what context? She picked something from between her front teeth with a nail. Madison's stomach turned. Quite sure I wouldn't need to spell it out to you, with your special gift and all. Don't mock my gift. She wriggled the nail she'd just used as a toothpick. Madison stepped back and extended her arm. Any of these men the one that left with Eunice? That one, there. She pressed the dirty nail to Madison's screen, smearing her teeth gunk all over it. Yuck! Was that necessary? Claus hitched her shoulders. The mutual dislike, alive and well. But she'd pointed out the man from Jackson's lobby. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back to get this on record. Whatever. Bye for now. Madison turned and left. She had little patience to start with, and this woman pushed it well past its limits. We have our visual ID. Sure, we're building our case, but she put her freaking cooties all over my phone. She curled her lips in disgust. I'd wipe it on my pant leg, but... She mimicked shivers, though they were more real than performance. I need a new phone now. Oh, come on, give it to me. She shoved the phone in his direction, and he wiped it along the grass, inspected his work, and handed it back to her. There, good as new. She looked at her screen. It was wet from the damp grass. Huh. She dried it on her pant leg and pushed it into a pocket. Only then did the positive ID fully impact her. Claus saw Eunice walk off with the killer. That was no longer in question at all. It also meant Eunice was in real danger. That's if she and Terry weren't already too late to save her. If Madison had the woman's full name, she'd issue a be on the lookout bulletin. But she had so very little information to provide. She's missing, and there's nothing we can... Missing. And there it was again, the tingling of an epiphany, but it was just out of focus. Yes, as you said twice, in the same sentence. What about it? Our killer is calm and collected, confident. Yes, as we've said before. And this isn't a new line of thought, but it's entirely possible that he killed before Tara Jackson and Joanna Chase. The epiphany was beginning to crystallize. Yes, again, something we discussed. If he did, that could explain the clean cuts and relaxed manner. Short of connecting with the FBI and having them search VICAP and getting them to search for previous unsolved cases similar to ours, there is something else we can try. The Violent Criminal Apprehension Program was a database that housed unsolved crimes. Don't keep me waiting. Missing persons. Okay, but with Jackson and Chase, they weren't even gone long enough for anyone to consider them missing. Sure, okay, but it's possible there was someone out there reported as missing that he killed. Her body might not have been found. I say we search missing persons for young women reported in Stiles and the surrounding area going back 10 years. That would be more than sufficient, as the killer looked early 20s. Though he could be older than he looked. She added, We'll focus on any who look like Tara and Joanna. We could find someone, and with it, a fresh lead. Fresh? By looking back. I get it. Looking back doesn't necessarily feel like moving forward. But in this case, it might be. Especially since I have a feeling his face isn't in any database. We would have heard by now. You are supposed to be notified one way or the other. Her phone chimed with a message. She pulled it out. It's Samantha. No luck on the searches. Okay, and the timing of that text isn't crazy. She shrugged. That was life. Unexpected and coincidental. My gut is telling me this is what we must do. We mentioned getting proactive, and I think this is how we do that. Going to say it again, by looking to the past? Yup. Every murder victim has a story to tell. And his swagger, his confidence, I swear, comes from getting away with murder at least one time before Tara Jackson. Okay, 10 years ago? Factoring in him being 21 now, he'd be 11. It's just a parameter, Terry. I doubt it will be that far back. Just casting the net wide, and he might look younger than he actually is. Fair point. Him killing before would explain a lot to me. Lack of hesitation marks. His confidence, as I said, but also his method. He has worked out a way of neutralizing his targets. It would seem he killed Tara, butchered her, really, Terry inserted in a gruff voice. Yes, and in her own home with neighbors on each side. Why wouldn't they have heard something? There'd be reports of calls to 911. To me, he must have knocked her out with drugs or alcohol. Also something we've theorized about before. One small mercy. Yes and no. I'm sure Tara and Joanna felt the stabbings. Just possibly were paralyzed and unable to do anything. You described hell. She had nothing to add. Didn't want to give it any more thought either. They loaded into the department car. She brought up the missing persons database on the onboard computer and keyed in some parameters. Location, Stiles and surrounding area. Gender, female. Age, 15 to 21. Hair color, brown, black. Eye color, brown. Reported in the last 10 years. As she waited for the results to filter back, she shoved aside the dark thoughts that crept in. Each file would represent a living, breathing person with loved ones who missed them. And every one of them might not even be alive anymore. No justice, no closure. The results finished loading. "We have 5 young women," she told Terry. "I'll look at each of their photos." She started from the top and worked down. She froze on the last one. Her. Madison angled the screen so Terry could see it from the passenger seat. "She looks like she could be Tara and Joanna's younger sister." Daphne Tucker. Madison scrolled down, reading the report and knocking out the highlights. Reported by her parents when she was 18, residents of Colton. That's not too far from here either. It was a small town 45 minutes north of Stiles. She continued. "She was last seen 3 years ago. I'm not the math genius among us, but 3 years plus 18 would make her 21 present day." "Very good." Terry gave a less than enthusiastic golf clap. "Very funny. We need more information on this girl, where she was last seen, who she was with, what she was doing, all the specifics we can get." "Name of the officer the parents filed with?" Madison scrolled up for that information. "Detective Ken Finley with the Colton PD. Let's go, right now. We'll talk to him about this. Just 2 things first. 1, you're going to roll your eyes, but I'll say it anyway. Shouldn't we let Winston know about this? And the second thing, she wasn't in the mood to touch the first. Who knows if Detective Finley is even around anymore? If we're going to drive to Colton, we should make sure he's there. All right, that one I can get behind. I'll call the Colton PD and you call Winston." "Why am I not surprised you made that delegation?" he mumbled, but got on his phone. "He is your new best friend." She managed to keep that to herself and called the Colton PD. Within minutes, she confirmed that Detective Finley still worked there and told him to expect them within the hour. "I know. Yes. It's the best we have at this point. I feel it's worth a try, yes." Terry said goodbye and looked over at her. "He's been informed." "Uh-huh, and he wanted to know if you agreed with me, didn't he?" "What does it matter if he did?" "It matters because it undermines my authority as a detective. That's why. I don't need your approval stamp to make my ideas valid." "Come on, it's not that bad." "You know it is. Stiles PD is mostly a men's club, especially in major crimes." "Things will change." She didn't respond as she got them on the road for Colton. Maybe there were worse things than Terry becoming a sergeant. At least she felt he'd be fair and balanced, unlike chauvinistic Winston. That was, unless the position of authority changed him. Chapter 40. The drive to Colton took a bit longer than 45 minutes, as traffic wasn't cooperating. On the way, Madison had received a message from Troy that they were set to see the house tomorrow at 6. She only hoped this investigation would be resolved well before then. She didn't want to miss out on the place, and the impulsive side of her could have just told him to put in an offer. But even if she gave in, Troy wouldn't oblige. He gathered all the facts before making a decision. Madison and Terry checked in with an officer at the front desk of the Colton PD. He told them Detective Finley would be out for them in a few minutes. Terry took a seat in a row of chairs while Madison paced in a wide loop. "Hey, sorry to keep you waiting. Detectives Knight and Grant, I presume?" A man in his 40s was walking briskly toward them. He carried his tall frame with confidence and enthusiasm. It would seem the job hadn't sucked the life out of him, though it was doubtful he'd been subjected to anything close to the nightmare they'd face this week alone. "That's us. I'm Knight. We spoke on the phone. And you're Detective Finley?" "The one and only. You have questions about the Tucker case?" "We do. You have an office or conference room where we can talk?" Madison asked. "You betcha." Finley waved for them to follow him and turned down a hallway. He stood next to a doorway on the left and motioned them inside a conference room. "Since I knew you were coming, I pulled the investigation files from storage." One banker box sat on the table. "That's all? You know how it can be with missing person reports." Those types of cases were rarely actively investigated, which was definitely one flaw in the system. She was just a teenager. Technically, Daphne Tucker was an adult, but I did all I could. There were no obvious signs of foul play, but the parents believe she had been manipulated by a new guy she'd seen a few times. I don't suspect we'll find her alive. He scratched the top of his head. "What has you looking into Tucker? You never did say over the phone." This detective came with a lot of energy, and she respected that. "We have 2 open murder investigations and suspect the killer has previous victims. We feel quite strongly our case is connected with Daphne Tucker." "Go on." Finley rubbed his chin as he dropped into one of the swivel chairs around the table. Madison pulled one out and sat down. So did Terry. "Daphne looks a lot like... Well, here, look." Madison brought up photos on her phone of Tara Jackson and Joanna Chase. "Huh, I see the similarity." His voice disclosed he was still somewhat confused by what brought them here. "We'd like to know a bit more about Daphne, see if there's anything that might help us solve these murders." As she explained their stance to Finley, it sounded like they were reaching. But cases have been closed on much bigger leaps than this one. Sure. Her parents reported her, which you probably noted from the report." Madison and Terry nodded. Finley continued. "They woke up one morning to find Daphne gone. No note, but she had packed some of her clothes and shoes. Was she in any sort of argument with her parents leading up to this? Sounds like she ran away," Terry said. "Yes, and it was assumed that she had. What made it even more tragic was Daphne was set to graduate high school the following week." "This new boyfriend," Madison started. "Tell us about him." "His name was Shane Russo, and he was the last person to see her. Daphne went missing on a Saturday morning. She and Shane had gone out to the movies Friday night." "Was he investigated as a suspect in her disappearance?" Madison asked. Finley nodded. "Prime, but he was cleared. Son of a naval officer and described by teachers as a focused student. A friend of his, who also happened to be Daphne's stepbrother, said he was with Shane from 10 until 1 a.m. I spoke with the boy's father, who he lived with, and he'd confirmed." "Going back to Friday night, could anyone testify to seeing Russo drop her off?" Madison's mind was scheming. If this Shane Russo had killed her, what's to say he didn't make things look like she ran away? He could have easily snuck into Daphne's room and packed her clothing. Or even had her do it herself. He could have sweet-talked her into running off with him. Her mother and father saw her before going to bed Friday night. He pulled out a folder and flipped some pages. "Right here. It was 10:30. "What time did they wake up on Saturday?" Terry asked. "It was 8 by the time they noticed her missing. So it's assumed she left between being dropped off by Shane just after 10 and 8 the next morning. Even a shorter window than that, as she needed time to pack and sneak out," Madison corrected, running on the theory that Russo presented an offer Daphne couldn't refuse. She might have been an adult in the eyes of the law, but she'd still have had the malleable mind of a teenage girl. "Sure, yes, that's right." "Going back to that argument you mentioned, what was it about?" she asked. "About Shane. They didn't want her seeing him anymore." That made it more likely Daphne rebelled. "Why not? You just mentioned he was an exemplary student," Terry pointed out. "They believed that he was corrupting Daphne." "Are we talking premarital sex or something else?" Madison suspected there was more to it than sex, but had asked anyhow. They were certain she was sleeping with him. Their foremost concern was how drunk she was after returning home from being out with him on a few occasions. "And was she drunk that last Friday night?" Madison asked. The parents said no. Madison latched on to the hesitancy. "You're not so sure?" "I didn't get the sense they really spoke with her. There was a lot of eye contact between the parents. Shame, guilt, regret," Madison summarized. "That was my guess. Now, from what I found out, Shane did well in school, but according to some classmates and a close friend, he liked alcohol a little too much. He'd drink until he blacked out, found it entertaining. Though he never got involved with drugs, supposedly. And why was he released from suspicion? Madison hadn't seen a reason yet. He had a rock-solid alibi that cleared him. That being, she volleyed back. His mother said he got home around 1 a.m. Saturday and was at home with her the rest of the day. And I couldn't find a hole to poke. Madison gave that consideration. A mother might say anything to protect her child. There was the real possibility that if Shane had killed Daphne, he did so during the night and made it home before the sun rose. All day Saturday, but what about from 1 that morning until 8? She swears he was in bed. Now, just before you got here, I pulled a background on Shane Russo. Last phone number on file is out of service. I also drove by the address listed. He hasn't lived there for 2 years. The small town of Colton must see less crime than Stiles if Finley had this sort of time on his hands. Not that she didn't appreciate his initiative. Finley went on. His parents died 5 months ago in a car accident, dead on scene. That took away any chance of prodding the mother's statement. But was Shane Russo the killer they were after? Had his parents' death served as a trigger for Shane to start killing again, assuming he had killed Daphne? And if he had murdered her, why? Only 3 questions of many, but she might be able to get an answer to the first one. She pulled up a photo of their suspect on her phone and showed it to Finley. Does he look familiar to you? The Colton PD detective moved in and ended up taking her phone from her hands. I'll be. Detective? She prompted. If my eyes aren't playing a trick on me, I'd say that's Shane Russo. Goosebumps laced down Madison's arms. And the parents died only 5 months ago? Uh-huh. Last of his living relatives that I'm aware of. We need to know everything you do about him, she said. I shared everything I know with you. Where did you get that picture of him? Madison brought the detective up to speed. You said you pulled a report? Yes, but the address and number are outdated. Her mind was spinning. Being this close to the killer, yet so far away, was frustrating as hell. Wait, you said he hadn't lived at the address on file for 2 years? I'm assuming you found this out from the current occupants? That's right. It was possible Russo's record was out of date. Where were the parents living before they died? The questions just kept coming to her, and she rolled them out, trusting the answers would lead her somewhere worthwhile. It was possible Shane's file had never been updated. Let's see. He pulled a laptop sitting on the table closer to him, flipped the lid open, and got to typing. A few moments later, he provided her with an address in downtown Stiles. Madison could hardly breathe. This is it. Does Shane Russo have any vehicles registered to him? Let me look in the licensing database. More key clicks, then nothing. Not the answer she'd expected, but the thought occurred to her that Shane Russo might have inherited one from his parents. What about the Russos, the mom and dad? Did they have any vehicles they might have left him? 1 second. Finley pecked on the keyboard again. Yup. Looks like it's owned outright, but the licensing for it has lapsed. Madison popped up and paced, unable to sit still. Vehicle type? A silver Ford F-150 pickup, 3 years old. We need to move. She tore out of the room. Chapter 41. Madison drove like a race car driver back to Stiles. We need a bolo issued for the Ford to start. Actually, we need to bring Winston up to speed first. Do it. Terry made the call, and she eavesdropped until she received a call from Cynthia. There's a lot of blood showing up in Tara Jackson's tub under special lighting. Other tests confirm, Cynthia told her. Chills ran through Madison. She'd expected this outcome, but it didn't make it easier to accept now that it was here. You hear me all right? Cynthia asked her. I did. Let me know what you find out at Joanna Chase's once you get there. Will do. Madison hung up, but continued to cradle her phone, as if it were a lifeline to her sanity. Terry hung up and told Madison, Officers will meet us at the apartment complex, just for due diligence. She nodded. Shane Russo was a bloodthirsty killer, and he needed to be taken off the streets yesterday. At least they weren't going to be held up by SWAT needing to clear the place. Terry continued. The Sarge made it clear, though, if we find out Russo is living in that apartment, we are to step back and wait for SWAT. And there it is. She told Terry what Cynthia found at Jackson's apartment. Right there, neighbors all around, he said. It sounds impossible, I know. Madison pulled into a parking lot and took a spot near the main entrance. Well, we're here. The building was middle class, nothing special about it. They got out and Terry said, This isn't on you. He must have been reading her thoughts because she was back in self-chastisement hell. The cleaner, though, I should have known. Why? You'd have no reason to think she was killed in her own place. So what? It smelled like cleaner. She liked a clean and tidy place. Cut yourself some slack. You really are your own worst enemy. She wished to accept his statement. It also made her think of her therapist's question. Why do you feel like you must be strong all the time? One day, she might have the answer. Right now, other matters demanded her focus. She pressed the intercom button for the building manager, and a woman's voice came over the speaker. Stiles PD, ma'am. We need to talk to you briefly. She intentionally left out mention that it had to do with one of her tenants, even possibly former. No verbal response, but there was a loud buzzing noise when the door unlocked. Terry got the door for them, and they headed straight to the building manager's apartment. A woman was standing in the doorway. She had bangles on her wrists and crystals or diamonds sparkling in her earlobes. What do you need to talk to me about? She was a pretty woman until the question had her brow wrinkling. The occupant of apartment 516, Madison said. What about them? The fact that it was plural wasn't missed. Their names? Nah, not how it works. You got a warrant or something? With all the crime dramas on TV, it seemed everyone just skipped ahead to this request, even when it didn't apply. We're specifically interested in the Russo family. They are dead, and they left me with a mess to clean up, too. Do you know their son, Shane Russo? Terry asked. I knew him, sure. He lived here for about 2 seconds. Strange kid. Tried calling him after his folks died, to clean out the place. But the number I had for him was disconnected. Madison brought up Russo's photo on her phone and held her screen toward the woman. This him? Yep. He done something? The woman angled her head and narrowed her eyes, her gaze studying Madison. He's a person of interest to the police, ma'am. Terry jumped in, saving Madison from being a little more direct. You said he lived here for a bit. When was this? She asked. A couple years back now. He left a few months before his folks died. They had a huge fight when he dropped out of college. I got lots of noise complaints from the neighbors. Do you know what he was studying in school? Shot in the dark, but Richards had said the killer possessed an above-average knowledge of human anatomy. Yeah, a doctor. His dad was pushing it to happen from what I gathered. How's that? Terry asked. He fired off during one of their fights that Shane was blowing up his life, and he didn't realize the opportunity he had to make his life better. Do you have a forwarding address for him? She asked. If I had that, I'd have had all his parents' stuff dropped at his doorstep. When he was living here, did you see any friends visit him? It was a stretch that she'd remember anything worthwhile after all this time. Madison still had to ask. And the other long reach had paid off, so this one could too. Not that I recall. If you hear from him or see him again, call me right away. Name's Detective Madison Knight. She handed the manager her card and turned to leave. Hey, if you catch up with him, he owes me $1,000 for dealing with all the crap. Madison waved a hand over her shoulder. He owed society a lot more than that, not to mention the poor families he'd robbed of loved ones. It was a long shot, Terry said as he loaded into the passenger seat of the department car. I mean, he never even showed as living here on record. He has some medical training. And where the hell did he go? She slapped the steering wheel. We're so close, Terry, but so far away. He has no living relatives, which Detective Finley told us. Oh! She glanced over at him, eyes wide. You kinda scare me when you look like that. The detective mentioned Daphne's stepbrother alibied Russo for Friday night until early Saturday. What if they're still in touch? Could be another long shot. Sometimes they pay off. Here goes nothing. Terry took out his phone and made the call to the Colton PD. She sat there listening, impressed by his initiative. It was uncharacteristic for her partner, and even more so after 7 at night when they were into overtime. Terry ended the call. You probably gathered this, but Finley's left for the day. The officer at the front desk will pass along a message to his cell. His phone rang. He flashed the screen toward her, and she caught the fact that it showed the caller was unknown. Detective Grant. Yes. Detective Finley. I just wanted to see if you could give us the name of Daphne's stepbrother. Yup, the one who said that. Thanks. Terry turned to face her, his phone still to an ear. Finley, and he's... Yeah, I'm here. Okay, thanks. He ended the call and lowered his arm. Terry, she prompted. He slowly turned toward her. You're not going to believe this, but Tucker's stepbrother is also the friend who said Russo would drink until he blacked out. Name, Terry. Apparently, he lived with his father when his mom married Tucker's dad. Spit it out. Gabe Proctor. Holy... Terry held up a hand. Wow, she said instead of the expletive. She blinked slowly, shocked by what she was hearing. Were he and Shane working together? It was Russo that Claus had ID'd as leaving with Eunice. Was Gabe ever considered a suspect back then? Not according to Finley. But what reason could he have to kill his stepsister? Who knows at this point? Sibling rivalry? He could have been against the marriage and took it out on Daphne. We'll have to ask him once we bring him in. In the least, they had a link to Russo. Madison pressed the gas pedal to the floor, weaving through the evening traffic in the downtown core and breezing through an orange to red. Her mind was screaming at her. They had Gabe Proctor and let him go. Had they royally screwed up? Chapter 42. Madison pounded on Gabe Proctor's door, and a few neighbors poked their heads out into the hall. They tucked them back in when she and Terry held up their badges. Gabe Proctor! Stiles PD! Open up! She roared as she resumed beating on the door. I don't think he's here. It's quiet as a... Don't say tomb. Crap! She raked a hand through her hair. They'd had him. They let him go. Now another woman could have paid the price for their error. Go get the super for the building. We need inside. Time to update the sergeant again? Require backup? Fine, I'll make the call this time. She was the senior detective, and she might as well take the hit for this. Winston answered on the third ring. Detective Knight here, and I need to fill you in on our prog... What? You're going to communicate? Mark the calendar. Madison clenched her jaw, counted to 3, worked to even her breath. Then she told him what happened at the Russo's old apartment and that they were now at Gabe Proctor's door. Didn't we have him in custody? She shook her head. He wanted to assign all the blame to her, but she was doing enough self-chastising without his help. There wasn't enough to hold him. Pointing out that he'd told her to cut him loose would just prolong this conversation. And you think he killed his stepsister? Worked with this Shane Russo guy to kill Jackson and Chase? Suspect that, yes. And this right here was another reason she loathed talking to Winston. He spoke in circles, repeating and reiterating what had already been said. It was like he needed to hear everything in his own voice to comprehend it. After a few beats, Winston said, I'll worry about the warrant. You get in his apartment. Done. She hung up before he could say another word. She filled Terry in, and he hurried to the building manager's apartment. She stayed put outside Proctor's door and looked at her phone. She opened the link to the house and scrolled through the pictures. So much of it was just how she remembered. She relished in the brief distraction of her memories, but it didn't last long. Terry returned with the building manager at his side. She tucked her phone into a pocket as the apartment was unlocked. The manager cracked the door, and she pushed in front of him. Stopped short. The place looked ransacked. What the hell? She turned and directed the manager to stay in the hall. Voices were approaching from down the corridor, and she could tell from what was being said that it was uniformed officers. Winston must have put in the request. Terry stepped up beside her, and then they spread out. She headed to the bedroom, following a niggling she couldn't ignore. When she graced the doorway, her suspicions were confirmed. "He's gone," she said to Terry as he joined her. "Look." She pointed at the closet doors, which were open, items strewn around the room. Dresser drawers were open, most of them empty. "He's not just gone, he's on the run." "Looks like it." Madison returned to the building manager, and he was standing with 2 officers. "When did you last see Gabe Proctor?" Terry came up behind her. "I don't know." The door next to Proctor's apartment cracked open, and a man stepped into the hall. "I saw him leaving a couple of days ago with a bunch of bags in his hands. He seemed like he was in a hurry." "Did you talk to him? Did he say where he was going?" Madison pushed out. The man shook his head. "Didn't ask. He didn't say." Madison retreated into the apartment again with Terry. "He probably ran right after we let him go. He came back, packed up, and hit the road for who knows where. Guess there's no doubt he's guilty of something in this equation. There was nothing to indicate that Chase had ever been here. Tara, yes, but that could be dismissed. She was seeing Proctor. But nothing indicated violence. Because he and Russo killed them in their homes." She laid a hand on her stomach. It was likely only a matter of time before it was confirmed that Joanna Chase had been killed in her place, too. This couldn't be happening. They had Proctor, and they'd let him go. Proctor wasn't captured on the video from the lobby at the Sunrise building, though. So, Proctor does the legwork, finds the girls, and Russo does the killing. But we also know it was Russo that Claus saw leaving the park with Eunice, Terry said. Yes, but Proctor could fit the description of the man who bought the suitcase. We can't ignore the glaring evidence. Shane Russo was the one on video holding the suitcase containing Tara Jackson's remains. Gabe Proctor was nowhere in sight. None of this would explain why Proctor's on the run, though, unless it goes back to Proctor's stepsister, Daphne. It could be that Russo holds some power over Proctor. Something large enough to keep him quiet? Could be. There had to be some way to track Proctor down. No sooner had the thought occurred than she landed on a possible solution. Proctor's buddies. I have their information. She stalled there, thinking about how forthcoming Proctor had been with their names and numbers. If he had something to hide with the recent murders, would he have handed this information over so easily? Or had he seen no option? It was also entirely possible that even if Proctor was involved in the murders, his bandmates could be in the dark. Let's get their addresses up in the car, and we'll pay them each a visit in person. I know it's already after 8, and phone calls would be faster, but Proctor might be staying with one of them. Terry waved a hand, consent and dismissal, and pecked a message into his phone. She'd guess it was to Annabelle, letting her know he'd be home quite late. And if it wasn't, it should have been. They left the building with implicit instructions to the building manager that no one was to enter Gabe Proctor's apartment except for her and Terry. To ensure this, she asked one of the officers to remain posted at his door. Winston might not have approved of the use of manpower, but uniformed officers didn't fall under his management. She had run it past the beat cop sergeant, and he had approved. In the car, she brought up backgrounds on the band members, and Terry made note of their addresses. She drove to the first on the list, John Foster. He lived in a brick 2-story with a crooked front porch. She tentatively took the steps one at a time, then banged on the door. The outdoor light turned on, and the door opened. Yeah? It was a man in his early 30s, and he was squinting and leaned to one side like his porch. He smelled of whiskey and beer. Madison held up her badge. Detective Knight, we talked on the phone earlier in the week. Yeah? Foster might have been on more than alcohol. We're looking for Gabe Proctor. Do you know where he might be? No idea. You try his place? This guy wouldn't be making rocket scientist anytime soon. He's not there, and it looks like he's packed up and left. Do you have any idea where he might have gone? Nope. The P came out emphasized. Favorite places he goes? Any girlfriends he might bunk up with? He doesn't have anyone right now. Okay, what about one of the other guys from the band? Terry asked. Maybe. It was like talking to a stump. Still, she persisted and showed him a shot of Shane Russo as captured on the video. Do you know this man? John leaned forward to get a good look and lost his balance momentarily, catching himself on the doorframe. He held up a hand. I'm okay. God grant me patience. But if it hasn't happened yet... Do you know him? Nope. Again with the popping P. Madison didn't say another word, just turned to leave. She didn't have any more time or patience left to waste on this guy. His stupidity didn't strike her as an act, sadly. She and Terry hit up the other band members, and they basically told them the same as John Foster. No one had seen Gabe Proctor for a day or two, none quite certain of the exact day, and none of them recognized Shane Russo. But if they lived in a fog of drugs and alcohol, their memories wouldn't be reliable. After the last friend, she pulled the car door shut hard enough that the entire vehicle rocked. What the hell are we going to do now? Call it a day and pick up again tomorrow? Terry pressed on a tight smile. Just unbelievable. We had him, Terry. Again, with no reason to keep holding him. And a couple of the bandmates did say their group was tight with Proctor. It's possible that he wasn't associating with Russo anymore. It is, but Proctor ran when he first saw us, and he's on the run now. She tossed that around in her mind, but it landed on nothing but conjecture. Innocent explanations might exist, but she didn't count on it. Her phone rang, and it was Cynthia. Madison answered on speaker before the second ring. Do I want to know? Probably not, but it's not what you think. Chase's apartment is clear. She wasn't killed there? Not from what I'm seeing. Now they were looking for the second murder scene, Gabe Proctor and the killer. How are you and Terry coming along? Madison filled her in briefly as she drove herself and Terry back to the station. Yikes! So are these guys, Russo and Proctor, working together? Too soon to know, Terry interjected, and Madison shot him a look. Well, it is, really, he mumbled. She hated to admit it, even to herself, as it made her feel incompetent. But he was right. And this Russo guy just seems to have disappeared. No active number. I've got to go. Madison ended the call and pressed harder on the gas pedal. Please take it easy. I did think of one thing we can try. We have Proctor's phone records back at the station. Okay, and... We look at them and see if we can put him in contact with Shane Russo. And why didn't we think of this earlier? Well, it has been a whirlwind. And it would have been much better if we could have put our hands on the guy. We had to try Proctor's friends first. If I stay at this any later, Annabelle will kill me. She glanced over at Terry. Fine, you go home. I'll go through the paperwork. What do you know, partner? This is a first. He smirked at her, and she shook her head. But she couldn't correct him, because he was right. Chapter 43. Last night, Madison had worked through every incoming and outgoing number to Proctor's phone in the last month. She pulled up who each one was registered to, but none tied back to Shane Russo. Finally, admitting defeat and exhaustion, she had headed home just after midnight. Yet, here she was, 8.5 hours later, back at the station. Terry strolled in at 20 to 9 holding a coffee cup. She hopped up from her chair. Where have you been? Good morning, Knight. He was mumbling, and she'd wager he hadn't had a very good night's sleep. She should know the signs. Thankfully, she had slept through again. Though it might have more to do with getting into bed so late, not that her demons had left. For all she knew, they were sipping Mai Tais on a beach somewhere, passing the time until the flight home. We're going to talk to Winston. Okay. He dragged out, but followed her. Since when do you volunteer to do that? She knocked once on the sergeant's door and let herself in. Winston was at his desk and looked up. "I'd say I was seeing things, but I saw my eye doctor yesterday. He said my vision is good." She'd ignore that. "We have a viable suspect, and I suggest we get media on our side." "A press announcement?" "An article asking the public for their help in finding Shane Russo." "Nope. No way." "We'll spin it as he's a person of interest." "Let me ask you this. Can you directly tie him to the murders of Tara Jackson and Joanna Chase?" He held up a hand to stave off a response. "I'm not referring to hunches or suspicions. I'm talking about cold, hard evidence." "We have him on video going into Tara Jackson's building and out, with the suitcase she was found in," Madison said. "Forensics estimated it was about 100 pounds heavier going out. Tara's weight without blood. Doesn't mean the girl was inside." She bit her bottom lip, frustrated. "He bought the suitcase from the vagrant woman in Bradshaw Park. That woman is currently missing and was last seen leaving the park with him, backed up by an eyewitness who identified him from a photograph. Please, God, may I save her." She wasn't pointing out they didn't have him ID'd as buying the suitcase. Why give the sergeant any room for argument? Winston leaned back in his chair. "Say something. It is pretty damning." She couldn't resist nailing that in. "We can't take media announcements lightly. Once a man's name is out there, he's guilty, Sarge." His eyes snapped to hers. "All I'm hearing is science, estimations, suspicions. Get me more, and I'll have no issue with getting the article moving." "Sarge!" She snapped her mouth shut as he raised his hand again. The man didn't deserve the post he was given. "In the least, can we put out a bolo on him and Gabe Proctor?" Winston swiveled. "I'm good with that." If he expected an expression of gratitude, he'd be waiting forever. She stormed from the office toward the parking lot. She gestured inside their car and told Terry to get in. She pulled the seatbelt across. "Just be a better sergeant than Winston. Not that it should be difficult." "I will. And just so you know, I'm with you on this one. He should have approved your request to appeal to the media. Where are we going anyway?" "To check with the mailroom where Proctor worked." He took a long sip of his coffee, the first she'd seen, and made a show of swallowing. "And why is that?" "If he skipped town, he would want his last paycheck." It was an idea that had occurred to her when she'd opened her eyes that morning. "Let's give it a try." Madison hadn't put the car into gear yet, her mind scheming. How irritating to have the killer's face and his name, yet no way to get to him. They got on the road and were speaking to Proctor's boss within the half hour. "When did you last see him?" Madison asked. "Tuesday, when he left with you." "Have you heard from him since?" Madison asked, appreciating there was a distinct line between both questions. "I haven't." "Human resources?" She felt desperate. Probably sounded that way, too. "He'd want his last paycheck." The man called HR. Shortly after, he was hanging up and shaking his head. "They haven't heard a word." So whatever had Proctor packing up and leaving his apartment was significant enough that he was willing to sacrifice money. "Thanks for your help," Terry said when she didn't say anything. They left, and stepping out onto the sidewalk, she could have screamed. Images of the two young women, tortured the way they were, then butchered. She swallowed roughly, her eyes full of tears as she stared out, not settling her gaze on anything in particular. Shane Russo could be out there right now killing someone else. She feared that he'd already killed Eunice, no matter how badly she wished that wasn't true. Terry stepped up next to her. "We'll find him." "I'm not sure how." "We'll figure it out." She thought through the facts of the case, and much of it led to dead ends. "We're officially out of leads." "Not giving up yet. Let's talk everything through. We agree it's likely that Russo met Jackson and Chase somewhere in the downtown area. Specifically, ran into them at Skyline Diner or Ruby Beans." "Correct. The latter is pretty much verified. Cups from the coffee shop were in his truck's console. And we know that Joanna went earlier in the morning and Tara a bit later." "Where are you going with this, Terry?" But as she asked, she had the answer. Russo has a flexible schedule too, probably because he inherited when his parents died. If we reach out to the attorney who is tasked with the Russo estate, we might get an address. Brilliant idea. She wished she'd thought of it. They settled into the department car and started making some calls. It took about 40 minutes to get through to the right person and convince them to part with the information. But they now had an address for Shane Russo. Chapter 44. Madison banged on the door for Russo's apartment. No answer, but why should she be surprised? Shane was probably on the street somewhere watching them, aware that they had entered his building. We should keep up our streak of looping Winston in, Terry said. And if that psycho's in there, we'll want backup. She just wanted to move, but she didn't have a death wish either. She nodded. Terry made the call and updated Madison. Winston asked for time to get officers out and a warrant to enter Russo's apartment. So now we just sit here? Even with the remote possibility Eunice is in there and still alive? Seconds could count. Would you want that on your conscience? A silence fell between them so tense it could have been sliced with a knife. Suppose if there was anything that might give us probable cause. There's my partner. She squeezed Terry's shoulder and leaned in toward the door, sniffing and inhaling eagerly. What are you doing? She held up a finger. Looking for that probable cause you mentioned. Then she caught a slight whiff of what she was after. I think we have it. Place smells of bleach. So he's clean? That's not enough to justify entering. She nudged her shoulder into the door, but it didn't give at all, just hurt her. She stood back. But she wouldn't do for a lock-picking kit. She knocked on the manager's door and told him she needed in Russo's apartment and rattled off that they had probable cause. He's always been a strange duck, the manager muttered as he fished out a loaded key ring and selected one. He pushed it in the lock and twisted the handle. We'll come get you if we need you. Okay. The manager walked off in the direction of his unit. Madison and Terry entered the apartment, closing the door behind them. The place was tidy and organized, just as she'd expected. But the smell of bleach and other chemicals was stronger in the apartment than it had been in the hallway. Who uses that much bleach unless it's to cover up something? She said to Terry and felt an instant jab of responsibility. But it hadn't been anywhere near this strong in Jackson's apartment. Then again, she'd been killed Saturday night, and they were there a couple days later. If he'd killed Chase here, that would have been a couple days ago too now. But the fact that it was so strong here, did that mean Russo had recently killed someone here? Had it been Eunice? Were they too late? In the living room, Madison looked inside a lidded ottoman and instantly recoiled. Look at this. She stepped back and pointed inside. Holy! Yeah, snuff films, and a boatload of them. She gloved up, moved some around, and uncovered a piece of paper with scribbled handwriting. Shivers tore through her at the list of names. All infamous serial killers. This guy idolizes murderers. Terry's voice was barely above a whisper. It would seem her partner was having a hard time processing that fact like she was. There has to be at least 50 movies in here. She set down the piece of paper and headed for the bedroom. Chills laced through her. It felt like the place was possessed by a supernatural evil. She shivered, not typically believing in such things. Another strong smell hit her nose. Whiskey and tequila. The door was closed. She drew her gun and slowly opened it. Eunice was tied to a kitchen chair that was on top of plastic sheeting splashed with blood. Madison fought her gag reflex and focused on Eunice. Her blankets were nowhere to be seen, and she was in a t-shirt and jogging pants. She had been stabbed several times, and her chin was dipped toward her chest. Madison's legs buckled. She should call for Terry, but she could barely draw breath. They'd been too late to save her. Tears burned in Madison's eyes, and an ache burrowed in her chest. Terry was right. This job was a hell they should run from. But then she heard a soft groan. Or had she imagined it? She put her gun back in its holster and rushed to Eunice. "It's Detective Knight. I've got you." Then the woman's head lifted, her eyes widened, and her mouth opened in a silent scream. Madison turned around, but not fast enough. Shane Russo lunged from the closet, his eyes wide and crazed, and he reached out for her. He held a knife in his hand, and she juked to the side, barely escaping a brush with the blade. Her shirt hadn't, as it tore the fabric. "Terry!" she called out. "Russo! Armed!" Terry's footsteps pounded across the apartment floor, getting closer, but Madison needed to pay attention to Russo. He kept jabbing out with the knife, but Madison stayed in front of Eunice, barricading her. Her weapon was once again at the ready, but with Russo's sporadic movements, she couldn't get a clear fix on him. And bullets traveled through drywall. She wasn't going to risk innocent casualties. "Put the knife down, now!" Terry yelled at Russo from the doorway. He smiled and spun, then started going toward Terry with the knife. Madison pulled her trigger, twice. The reports were deafening, but a small price to pay. Russo crumpled to the floor. Chapter 45. A few days later. Madison and Terry walked into the hospital room where Shane Russo lay on the bed. He'd survived his injuries, against the odds. The upside was he'd need to stand trial and pay for his crimes. Downside was the county would need to pay his room and board for the rest of his natural life. They'd found blood evidence that Joanna Chase had been in Russo's apartment. The DNA was still being processed, but the blood type was right. They also found her purse, laptop, and phone in his closet. As for Tara Jackson's clothing, it wouldn't surprise Madison if he'd washed them and put them back in her dresser. Why he'd taken her purse and tossed it in a dumpster was unknown, but possibly some unconscious attempt to toy with the police. They had the knives used for the stabbing and mutilation. Between her and Terry, they had decided she'd handle the interview. Terry would be there for support. Detectives. In his morphine state, Russo smiled at them, a cross between a grin and a smirk. The expression sent chills right through her. Madison buried her repulsion, faced the fear she had of this guy. His mind was messed up, likely not aided by his childhood. A thorough check into his past revealed domestic violence and a strict upbringing. His naval father was the head of the house and had beaten that fact into Russo and his mother. "I saw you coming, you know," Russo said, his voice higher than natural for a 21-year-old man. It was like he was possessed. A fresh batch of goosebumps rose along her arms. "Through the peephole. When I heard you coming in, I thought I'd hide. Just have a little fun." She refused to be pulled into his mind games and walked toward the bed, leveled her gaze at him, and said, "How did you know Tara Jackson and Joanna Chase?" "Just saw them around. Struck up some conversation. They couldn't resist me when I asked them out." She squeezed out what his true intent had been and asked, "Why did you kill them?" "Because I could. Because I wanted to. Because it made me happy. It's why I kill anyone." "How many people have you killed?" "Wouldn't you like to know?" "Why kill Daphne Tucker?" "Who said I did?" After Russo's arrest hit the news, Proctor had come forward. He confessed to being present when Russo killed his stepsister, Daphne Tucker, by stabbing, but swore he had no idea where her body was. When confronted with the fact that Russo had an alibi in his mother, Proctor said that was no surprise. The woman had worshipped her boy and would have said anything. Proctor had also said he took the rap for hurting a neighborhood dog that Russo had hurt. All this because he was terrified of Russo and what he might do if he broke his silence. It might have taken years, but Lady Justice was finally having her day. Proctor would be going to prison for accessory to murder. She squared her shoulders. "Gabe Proctor." Russo's eyes widened slightly. Surprise. "No way." He said he was tired of living with the guilt, of holding on to your secret, of being afraid of you. In fact, he told us all about it. How you got her really drunk and then stabbed her. He was smiling again, his eyes sparkling, as if raptured in a happy memory. Why her? She was my first. I needed to know how it would feel. Shivers raked through her. That's all? What more is needed? She stiffened. Where is she now? I'd like to talk about a deal before I tell you that. You're in no position. I'd like my memoir written by an A-list author, he said, as if she hadn't even spoken. At this moment, Madison was less afraid of him and more interested in punching him in the face. We can see what we can do, she said through clenched teeth, all the while thinking there was no way in hell she'd let that happen. He told her where to find Daphne Tucker's remains. His detailed directions would take them to a rural area just 2 miles from the Tuckers' home. She really thought we were going to run away together, Russo laughed. Madison steeled herself, redirected back to Jackson and Chase. Why did you stab Tara and Joanna 21 times? He shrugged. Their age. And what about the woman from Bradshaw Park? You think I forgot about her? Her name was Eunice. Though why she'd bothered humanizing her to this degenerate, she had no idea. It wasn't like it would have any effect. Oh, she was just some extra fun for me. But you held on to her for days. Why not kill her right away? She was my pet, and I figured you'd eventually come for her. Then I'd kill her while you watched, helpless. Sick freak. You screwed up, though. I got the upper hand on you. She is still alive and on the road to a full recovery. Russo snarled and tugged on the cuffs that secured him to the bed frame. She smiled and turned to leave. Hey, don't go. Let's talk about my memoir. She waved a hand over her head. There's nothing to talk about. Out in the hall, she said to Terry, Russo deserves the death penalty. Rehabilitation won't work on him. Call it a hunch. 3 charges of murder, 1 of kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder. He's going to die in prison. I hope you're right. Her heart sank because the system didn't always work. 2 specks of light shone through all this darkness, though. Eunice's survival and justice for the victims. She'd hold on to this in the days ahead because she saw herself doing this job for life. The dogs have found something over here, one of the K-9 handlers called out. Madison hurried over with Terry and stood by as Cynthia and Mark worked to uncover the find. After another hour of painfully waiting, they had Daphne's body. It had been mutilated, severed into multiple pieces, and put into a wooden crate and buried. A horrible sight, but at least her family would finally have closure. I need to leave, she told Terry. Going to see that house? She nodded. After everything that had transpired at Russo's apartment, she had no choice but to postpone the showing. But now that time had arrived. Oh, before I go, she fished a $20 bill from a pocket. You said we were after a serial killer. Terry held up a hand. Nah, you keep it. I don't want it. And how about we stop these little wagers of ours? I think that's a great idea. She put the money away and left. She couldn't get to the house fast enough as her excitement grew with each mile she got closer. She couldn't wait to step inside the house that had meant so much to her and held such great memories. Troy and Estelle were waiting at the curb out front. Madison took Troy's hand and held it as they made their way through the house. As soon as she stepped inside, she flashed to the past when she'd spent weeks here in the summer as a girl. She could still smell the gas stove and mac and cheese cooking in the oven. The walls in the guest bedroom were still the light lilac that Madison and her sister, Chelsea, painted. And the wallpaper going up the stairs had gone up when her grandparents had lived there. Other rooms had changed colors and finishes, but the roots remained. In the backyard, the patio slab was still there. It had marbles embedded into the concrete, a feature she loved looking at as a child, even though they'd been there long before her time. It was hard to keep all her feelings of nostalgia bottled inside. She stopped trying after Estelle left. A few tears splashed Madison's cheeks. "Oh." Troy wiped them away. "You hate it that much that you're going to cry?" He was teasing, his green eyes sparkling. "Nope. I love it that much. Let's call Estelle and make an offer." "You're sure?" "Absolutely. But there is something I want to tell you about this house." She gave it a few seconds, then admitted, "It used to be my grandparents' place." "Grandma Rose?" She smiled at him and caressed his cheek, nodded. "Yes." She'd told him how much her grandmother had meant to her many times. Also how devastated Madison had been years ago when a malignant brain tumor had claimed her life. "Then it's confirmed. We need this house." They discussed their offer and informed Estelle. "I'll get it in right away." With that, the real estate agent left. Madison and Troy were still standing in the driveway. She faced him. "I want our wedding here." "Okay. When are you thinking? Next spring? Summer?" At the mention of waiting a year, he sounded disappointed. She shook her head. "Nope. As soon as we close. Well, let's do it a month or two afterward. Give us a few minutes to unpack." "How about December?" "You want to get married then?" He was grinning like it was the most natural expression for him. Any fear she had of taking that huge step was gone. Troy made it easier to surrender. When they went home, she'd tell him everything. What the nightmares were about, her early morning drives, her fears when she was awake. "I do." He smiled. "I do? Are you practicing?" "I love it." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her hard. Things change. It's a fact of life. She could either continue fighting it or just give in. And right now, the latter held greater appeal. A letter from Carolyn. Dear listener, thank you for choosing to listen to Her Dark Grave. If you enjoyed it and would like to hear about new releases in the Detective Madison Knight series, just sign up at the following link. Your email address will never be shared, and you can unsubscribe at any time. carolynarnold.net/MK updates. If you loved Her Dark Grave, I would be incredibly grateful if you would write a brief, honest review. Also, if you'd like to continue investigating murder, you'll be happy to know there will be more Detective Madison Knight books. I also offer several other international best-selling series and have a number of published books for you to savor. Everything from cozy mysteries to crime fiction and thrillers to action adventures. Please visit my website to browse all my available titles. Often, as a writer, I'm asked what inspired a book, and for this one, I pulled from a real-life case that I learned about when my husband and I attended the local Citizens Police Academy. This was several years ago now, but the investigation stuck with me. I recall having a hard time sleeping the night I'd learned about it. The detective who had been in charge of the case had passed around some evidence from the murder scene. I was able to see firsthand blood spatter on a tequila bottle, a handwritten list of snuff films, and another one noting serial killers that the perp had idolized. Thankfully, the fact that they were able to look at these things was because the case was closed, and the killer was put behind bars. He had killed his best friend, someone he apparently drank heavily with on regular occasion. They rented a hotel room, and I can't remember why they were there. But adding to the chill factor was the lobby video captured the victim carrying in the bag he ended up being found in. This killer managed to intoxicate his friend to the point of his passing out, stabbed him numerous times, and severed his body in the tub, all in a hotel room. After he killed his friend, from what I remember, he called the police. The motive for murder? He just wanted to know what it would feel like to kill someone. When the police showed up, the room was spotless, and it would never be suspected it was the scene of such a brutal murder. They say real life is stranger than fiction, and I'd say this is another example of that. As always, I want to mention my husband, George, who is my best friend. He's believed in me and my writing from the start, and he always keeps me fed and taken care of when I sequester myself to my writing and editing cave. This time, he rose even further above by helping me with researching points from previous Madison Knight novels to flesh out the story even more. Thank you, George. I also want to voice my appreciation for the editors who worked on this book and helped push me to make it the best it could be. Last, but certainly not least, I love hearing from my readers. You can get in touch through my Facebook page, Twitter, Goodreads, or my website. This is also a good way to stay notified of my new releases. You can also reach out to me via email at carolyn@carolynarnold.net. Wishing you a thrill a word, Carolyn Arnold. Connect with Carolyn Arnold online at carolynarnold.net, facebook.com/author Carolyn Arnold, and twitter.com/Carolyn_Arnold. For more audiobooks by Carolyn Arnold, visit carolynarnold.net/audiobooks. You can also sign up to be notified when new titles become available. This has been Her Dark Grave. Written by Carolyn Arnold. Narrated by Samantha Novak. Copyright year 2023 by Carolyn Arnold. Production copyright by Carolyn Arnold.